Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the second part of What If Deku Had a Jackal Quirk, written by ᴅᴜᴜᴜ. All credit for this story goes to ᴅᴜᴜᴜ, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Izuku could hardly sleep the day before he started UA. Despite the lack of sleep though, he felt like his entire body was electrified the following morning. He left home early, practically jogging to the station, and then failed at keeping still the entire train ride. Izuku got some annoyed glances from other commuters who obviously were not looking forward to their Monday morning. But Izuku felt like nothing could ruin this day for him. Even finding out he was in the same class as Kaken, which was nerve-wracking, couldn't put a damper on his day. Missing orientation in favor of a quirk assessment, while disappointing, was also not that bad. Aizawa-sensei's words though, that kind of had Izuku's joy flattened immediately. Whoever gets last place is expelled. Izuku swallowed. He had to clench his fists to keep from fidgeting with his hands to release the nervous energy bottled up inside him. Expelled. He thought the hard part would be getting into UA. He didn't realize it might be just as hard to stay. Kaken didn't look worried. But Izuku could also feel in watching him. Kaken still wanted to see his quirk. Still wanted to fight him. After they'd both been accepted, Kaken hadn't taken it too well. Kaken shoved Izuku against the gym wall, pressing him hard against it with the death grip he had on the front of Izuku's uniform. Izuku was being caught more frequently now that Toshinori no longer was picking him up from school. How? Kaken demanded, eyes blazing. I told you, Izuku managed to say. Kaken's fist was pressed hard against his neck. I've been training with my quirk. Then show it to me. Kaken ordered, but the way he said it made Izuku think he thought Izuku was lying. Izuku just stared. There was just no way he would do anything that might let the jackal out. Coward. Izuku ignored the dark hiss. No, Izuku answered. He kept his tone even, his voice firm. Kaken's eyes widened. What? Kaken snapped, not believing Izuku had actually stood up to him to this extent. I said no, Kaken. Izuku glared back at his once childhood friend. I earned my spot at UA and I don't have to explain to you how I got it. The jackal paced at the door's edge, watching, waiting. You can hurt me if you want, but I'm not going to give you what you want. Izuku himself was shocked he hadn't stammered or stuttered even a little. The jackal growled in the dark, not liking Izuku's statement though. It didn't like Izuku rolling over and playing punching bag. Izuku had years of practice at it though. Kaken released him like he'd been burned by Izuku's words. His eyes were still wide and his mouth twisted in a kind of snarl. For a moment Izuku thought Kaken was going to hit him. But in the end he just walked away. All around Izuku, his classmates were stretching or readying their quirks. That was one of the coolest parts of his class in Izuku's opinion, all the different interesting quirks and how they were used. Izuku felt just a little bad that his own quirk didn't require any kind of thoughtful ingenuity like some of the others, not for a physical test anyway like the one Aizawa-sensei had made for them. Izuku made sure to take his shoes off before he started. Then he made sure to use as little of the jackal as possible, only what he needed to help him regulate using One for All. He hoped he could get the hang of using One for All without the jackal's help at some point. Izuku stepped up to the ball throw. He'd done a lot of research on what muscles were needed to throw a punch, a kick, and other common actions he would take. After all, he needed to know which parts, which muscles, of the jackal he needed to utilize. The less the better. A ball throw. His arm, obviously, his shoulder, probably part of his torso too just to be safe. A lot more than he'd been using so far. Right. Izuku looked down at his gym uniform. He really didn't want to mess it up. Grimacing and feeling a little, self-conscious, Izuku took off his gym shirt and set it down. He caught a few questioning looks from his classmates, a couple took note of his scars, but Aizawa-sensei remained impassive. Taking a deep breath, Izuku used his left hand to start a beat against his leg. Hopefully the beat was all he would continue to need. He drew on the Jackal's power. His right arm shifted, the muscles tightening, growing, until his arm, shoulder, and half his torso was that of the Jackal. Izuku picked up the ball. Once again he reached inside, but this time he grabbed a hold of One for All, channeling it through the Jackal's arm. Izuku threw the ball as green static erupted around his Jackal arm. The ball shot forward out of sight in an instant. The Jackal's muscles flinched at the strain. It could handle One for All, but it still took a toll. Izawa-sensei called out how far the ball had gone, and Izuku thought he heard some impressed noises from his classmates, but he couldn't focus on it, didn't hear any of it. The Jackal clawed beneath his skin and Izuku tapped the beat against his leg a little faster, muttering out the words to the English song he'd chosen. Izuku felt half of his face changing and the vision in his right eye turned sharper. Panic made his heart begin to hammer. He couldn't lose control. Izawa-sensei would expel him for sure if he attacked someone. Izuku's nose twitched, he could smell something behind him. Turning just a little he saw his classmates. He saw the short one with the purple-black ball-shaped hair. "You stink of fear." The Jackal's words made Izuku shiver. It was when Izawa-sensei's eyes narrowed that Izuku realized the Jackal had said it aloud through his mouth with its voice. Slamming the Jackal down, Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, his mumbled words slurring together until the Jackal was thrown back into the darkness behind the door. "Coward." Izuku shook his head and joined his classmates back in line. He pulled his gym shirt back on and ignored the watchful look his teacher was giving him. "That was really cool," ᴜᴜ whispered excitedly to him. She was so close Izuku couldn't help his face heating up just at the proximity. "A little scary though." Your voice changed too. "Oh, what's with the tapping and muttering, is that part of your quirk?" she asked, eyes bright. Sort of," Izuku offered, rubbing the back of his neck. "It, helps me keep focus." He could see Kaken out of the corner of his eye. He looked murderous. He looked like he was going to wait for Izuku after school and drag him behind the gym and force him to fight. Izuku swallowed and tried to think about something else. Izuku had never really had a lot of friends, or really any friends. So he was both surprised and delighted when ᴜᴜ and Iida sat with him at lunch. It was so nice. It also kept him insulated from Kaken. Always a good thing. When classes finally ended, Izuku avoided Kaken. He could feel his red eyes following him, and he knew if he waited in the classroom Kaken would wait with him. If he tried to rush off school grounds, Kaken would somehow meet him near the gate and drag him off somewhere. So Izuku stuck close to Iida and ᴜᴜ up until they started to leave the building. Glancing around he didn't see Kaken anywhere, but he knew he'd end up splitting up with his group to head home, and Kaken lived in the same direction. I think I forgot something in the, classroom," Izuku said as they neared the door. "I'll, see you guys tomorrow." He waved and hurried back towards the classroom as both his new friends, were they friends? The thought made Izuku feel all warm and fuzzy, said goodbye to him. As he neared the classroom though, Izuku started wondering whether Kaken would have anticipated Izuku's avoidance strategy. A light sweat broke out of his forehead as he decided last minute not to enter the classroom. Just on the off chance Kaken was still in there waiting for him. Instead, Izuku headed back towards the exit. When he got there though, he just stood there. He hesitated in leaving. Stepping closer, he peeked out through the door trying to see if he could see Kaken. It had been a good while since class ended for the day, so theoretically Kaken would have just gone home by now. Still. Young Midoriya? Izuku jolted and whipped around. It was Toshinori. He wasn't in his all-might form, probably having determined that there shouldn't be any students around and those that were likely wouldn't recognize him. Izuku floundered. "Hi." He settled on before mentally slapping himself for his stupidity. "What are you still doing here?" Toshinori asked, his gaze moving from Izuku to whatever was on the other side of the door. He frowned. Izuku turned back, looking for whatever Toshinori had seen. And there he was. Izuku could just see some of Kaken's spiky hair sticking out from where he waited on the other side of the gate, probably for Izuku. It was nice to know he was paranoid for a reason. "Coward," the Jackal hissed. Izuku bit his lip and tried to ignore how right it was. He felt ashamed that Toshinori was witnessing his cowardice. "Come on," Toshinori gestured for Izuku to follow him. Izuku hurried after on reflex before wondering where they were going. "There's a back gate." Toshinori answered Izuku's unspoken question. Izuku felt a well of gratitude for his understanding and for not thinking too badly of him. He had stood up to Kaken before, he just was so tired and really didn't want to deal with him today. Besides, now he got to spend more time with Toshinori. "How was your first day?" Toshinori asked. And it wasn't like how most people asked, like they were just being polite. No, Toshinori asked like he was actually interested. With a smile, Izuku told him all about his first day at UA. Izuku had expected Toshinori to show him to the back gate and then part ways. When he didn't, Izuku thought maybe they were just headed to the same train station. When Toshinori got on his same train, Izuku realized he was being walked home. "You, don't have to walk me the whole way," Izuku murmured, his face felt hot. "I don't mind," Toshinori told him, and it sounded like he didn't. "It's good exercise for me anyway, the extra walking." He gave Izuku an easy grin and Izuku couldn't help dropping his gaze to his red shoes. Sometimes looking at Toshinori was like looking at the sun. Toshinori stopped at the entrance to the apartments Izuku and his mother lived at. He stood waiting, giving Izuku time to head up by himself. But Izuku couldn't help it, he'd stopped when Toshinori had, that he didn't want to leave. Toshinori rubbed at the back of his neck. "Will you be able to let the jackal out a little today, or are you keeping that to weekends?" Toshinori asked, curious but also giving Izuku an excuse to say goodbye. Izuku ducked his head, suddenly feeling a little guilty. Well, I haven't actually, I don't unless I'm with you." Toshinori frowned but seemed to understand nonetheless. "The jackal isn't as dangerous as you think," he told Izuku softly. Izuku wasn't so sure about that though. "And you can always call me if you need to." Izuku chewed his bottom lip. My mom has a late shift tonight, do you, want to come up?" Toshinori blinked and Izuku could feel his face burning up. He didn't know what had possessed him to make such an offer. "For the jackal," Izuku quickly added, mind racing to figure out how to correct his blunder. "So I'm not alone when I let it out." That's all." "Alright," Toshinori tentatively agreed. "If your mother doesn't mind." Izuku felt a little guilty at the reminder that he had failed to tell his mother about Toshinori or training his quirk. He knew Toshinori hadn't said it to be mean. It was also a reminder that Izuku was a high school student. For some reason that annoyed Izuku, being reminded that he was still just a student. His mother did trust him though. She'd said as much. Even though she'd been upset he hadn't told her, she hadn't really been mad or anything. Izuku hadn't been grounded. If she still trusted his judgment, then she shouldn't have a problem with him inviting Toshinori over. "She's fine with it," Izuku told him and privately congratulated himself on how sure he sounded. Not that he was unsure, really, much. He gestured for Toshinori to follow and he led him up to his apartment. "Would you like some tea?" Izuku asked, feeling only a little awkward as he and Toshinori removed their shoes at the doorway. He could feel the jackal grumbling, tapping its clawed finger in annoyance. Izuku ignored it. No, Toshinori answered quickly. "I don't want to impose." "You could never impose," Izuku argued. The very idea was preposterous. He showed Toshinori to the table and made a gesture for him to sit before heading to the kitchen. "You really don't have to make anything, Midoriya," Toshinori said, and Izuku jumped a little because he hadn't realized Toshinori had followed him to the kitchen. "It's a school night too, you don't want to be wasting too much of your time on me." "It's not a waste." Izuku was quick to defend, but he saw Toshinori's point. "Right. Okay then." He left the kitchen, pulling off his socks and then his school jacket and tie. It was as Izuku was unbuttoning his shirt that he noticed Toshinori was pointedly looking away from him. Izuku frowned but wasn't sure what to make of it. Izuku realized he didn't want his uniform pants to get messed up though either. So he trudged to his room and changed into a pair of shorts before coming back out. Toshinori waited patiently, still not really looking at him, though he'd taken a seat on the couch. Out, out, out. The jackal whined and clawed enough to make Izuku wince. With a breath, Izuku let himself change. The jackal gave a sigh and a snort. It flexed its muscles and Izuku could hear and feel his bones pop and crack. The jackal stretched and then it fixed its sights on Toshinori. Izuku was shoved into the darkness briefly. The black expanse was lonely and cold and he panicked, wondering what had happened before his senses suddenly returned. Izuku almost struggled for control against the jackal, but once he could see and feel and hear again he relaxed just a little. In the time Izuku was in the dark, the jackal had made its way over to Toshinori. It now sat on the floor, its head resting on Toshinori's leg. Toshinori's hand was running soothingly over its hide and Izuku let out a sigh he knew no one but the jackal could hear. "Nice, isn't it?" The jackal's deep dark voice murmured in the dark. Izuku thought for a moment it had spoken aloud, but Toshinori's movements didn't pause and he made no indication he'd heard. "Jackal?" Izuku called tentatively in the dark. "I am here." The deep rumbling voice returned. The jackal made the kukuku laughing noise that always felt jarring to Izuku. "Having me out isn't so bad, is it?" Izuku wasn't entirely sure he knew what the jackal meant. Or maybe he did and didn't want to admit to it. "He touches us more when you let me out," the jackal said lightly, its tone just a little suggestive. Suggestive enough for Izuku to feel like he'd be blushing if he could. But the jackal's comment also stung. Izuku knew Toshinori said he liked the jackal because it was a part of Izuku, which necessarily meant Toshinori liked Izuku, but Izuku couldn't help feel a little jealous of the jackal. True, Izuku got to feel everything the jackal felt when he wasn't in the dark, but it wasn't the same. He tried to enjoy the time he had with Toshinori, ignoring the jackal's comment. When the sun had set, Toshinori nudged the jackal lightly. The jackal always gave a heavy sigh, like it was doing Izuku such a big favor, returning his body. But it did retreat back into the dark. "Thanks," Izuku murmured when he could speak again. He was in the same position the jackal had been, his head still against Toshinori's warm leg. Toshinori coughed. "Any time," he replied, but his voice sounded a little strained. Izuku walked Toshinori down to the apartment's entrance. Toshinori told him he didn't need to, but Izuku did anyway. It was only a few flights of stairs. "I'll see you tomorrow," Izuku said it like a promise, and he knew his eyes were brighter than they ought to be, but he really couldn't help it. Toshinori coughed into his hand and Izuku couldn't tell whether his cheeks were tinged pink or just reflecting some of the sunset. It was then that Izuku saw Kaken. His former childhood friend was walking home still, which naturally took him past Izuku's apartment complex. A feeling of panic overtook Izuku. His eyes shot to Toshinori, who seemed to have just noticed Kaken as well. Izuku didn't think Kaken had seen either of them yet though. Izuku didn't really think about it so much as just did it. He lunged towards Toshinori, shoving him along with himself behind the building. Toshinori made an oofing noise, but Izuku didn't really notice over the pounding of his own heart. He wasn't really looking at Toshinori, instead Izuku's head was turned to the side where he could see just a sliver of the street. Kaken had stopped. He was looking at Izuku's building. Izuku held his breath. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a second, Kaken made a tch sound and continued striding towards home, clouds of anger rolling off him. There was something in his eyes though that reminded Izuku of worry. He wasn't sure what to think about that. When Kaken was out of sight he let out a long sigh. Then he turned back to Toshinori. Izuku froze. It was now that he realized he had shoved Toshinori's back up against the side of the building and then trapped him there by bracketing him in with his arms. Izuku was shorter, his gaze level with Toshinori's chest. He had to tilt his head up to see Toshinori's expression. Izuku wasn't sure he wanted to. He felt his face heating up. Toshinori coughed. "Right." He hadn't moved yet. Izuku jumped back, face blazing, and quickly stammered an apology. It had to only be Izuku's own wishful thinking that Toshinori's own face looked just a tad pink. "Coward." Izuku shoved against the hiss of a whisper, ignoring it. "What, Toshinori gave Izuku a puzzled look. ᴅᴇʟᴜᴜ, Izuku admitted before fixing his gaze on his shoes. He felt like such an idiot. He was actually surprised the Jackal hadn't called him a coward this time. Izuku rubbed his upper arm self-consciously. Toshinori's hand came to a rest on Izuku's head. That feeling of calm returned, overwhelming him. "It's fine," Toshinori told him and smiled reassuringly. "I'll see you tomorrow in class." He gave a wink and a final pat on the head before taking his leave. Izuku watched him go until he could no longer see him. With a long tired sigh, Izuku headed back inside. Izuku had no idea that his first day at UA would be so exhausting. Izuku's alarm grated on his ears. All Izuku wanted to do was go back to sleep. Instead he sat up, shut off his alarm, and got out of bed. It was still dark outside, but Izuku dutifully pulled on some sweats and headed out into the crisp morning air to do his daily jogging and exercises. By the time he got home, his mother was up. Izuku headed straight to the shower. He felt like he was on autopilot the whole time he got ready for school. Even his mom's bright enthusiasm didn't pull him from his exhausted state. Izuku hoped the day would get better. But he should have known better than to assume he might get lucky enough for that to happen. As soon as he got to the front of his apartment complex, he realized what his subconscious was already dreading. There, outside his apartment building, was Kaken. Waiting for him. Izuku felt his heart stop. He knew what this was about. "You're still seeing him," Kaken noted. And there it was. Of course Izuku hadn't been fast enough, and Kaken had seen him with Toshinori, even if only for a moment. Izuku was actually kinda surprised the first words out of his mouth weren't about Izuku using his quirk the day before. "It's not what you think," Izuku replied tiredly, then, more bitingly, "and thanks for telling my mom." Kaken blinked. It was enough of a reaction for Izuku to know he was correct in his guess that was how she had found out about Toshinori. Kaken made a scoffing sound and fell into step beside Izuku as they headed to the station. "You use your quirk now," Kaken commented. Izuku gave a noncommittal shrug, but didn't answer. Kaken growled. "What the fuck, Deku?" Kaken shoved Izuku back, forcing him to look at him. The moment Kaken touched him, the Jackal growled low and dark. A guttural primal threat only Izuku could hear. Izuku swallowed and tried to keep calm. "Stop fucking ignoring me," Kaken snarled. Just like a switch had been flipped, Kaken was livid. "Why?" he demanded. Izuku blinked. What?" Kaken glared like Izuku was being purposefully obtuse. "Why did you use your quirk with that weird old guy but not me?" Kaken asked darkly. "He's not old," Izuku responded immediately, "or weird." Kaken rolled his eyes as though Izuku was completely missing the point. "I spent years trying to get you to use your quirk," Kaken seethed, "and you use it for that guy, a stranger, no problem?" Anger rolled off him like steam, and Izuku was pretty sure he could see a vein throbbing in his forehead. Wasn't without P problems," Izuku tried to interject but was drowned out by an unintelligible frustrated noise from Kaken. "Your quirk is too fucking powerful for me to handle, but it's not for some fucking old guy." Kaken beared down on Izuku, who felt like his life would be better if he could somehow melt into a puddle. Or maybe just be swallowed by the ground, that would work too. "You are not better than me," Kaken growled, and Izuku blinked. What?" Izuku asked, honestly confused at this point. "Why would you think?" "So show it to me," Kaken snarled, reaching out and snaring Izuku's left wrist in one of his hands. His red eyes fixed on Izuku's hand like he expected it to change, to transform. "I'm happy to oblige," the Jackal hissed as Izuku's heart began to hammer in his chest. He tried not to let any of his fear show on his face. It wasn't as though he was afraid of Kaken after all. "No," Izuku snapped, drawing on some of the Jackal's simmering anger to strengthen his denial. Kaken's eyes widened, his expression livid. "It's not worth it," he said, glaring coldly. Pain exploded around Izuku's wrist. He flinched back as the smell of burning flesh assaulted his nose. Kaken released him, his own eyes wide, the blood draining from his face. Izuku looked down at the wrist Kaken had been holding. It was burned. The skin red and raw, and even blackening slightly. Izuku was frozen. The jackal howled. Izuku didn't have time to start a beat, or to try to use any conventional methods to stay present. He wasn't sure how he knew it would work, he wasn't really sure that it would. But pain was something that had always seemed to keep him present, like when he'd broken his arm using One for All for the first time. The jackal hadn't come out then. As the jackal's claws dug rivets into the open door inside him, Izuku's right hand shot out and squeezed his left wrist. Another wave of pain shot through him, but Izuku kept his right hand latched tightly over the new burn, aggravating it. Sharp throbbing pain was all Izuku felt from his burnt wrist. Kaken looked horrified, not by Izuku's actions, he didn't seem to really notice that. No, Kaken was looking from Izuku's burned wrist to his own hand. But why was Kaken having this reaction, Izuku suddenly wondered. He had hurt Izuku before. Izuku still had a burn scar on his shoulder from years ago and a few more small ones over his torso. But then, those had all been intentional, Izuku realized. Was that it? The difference? Kaken had meant to hurt Izuku all those times before, but he hadn't intended to now? He'd simply lost control of his quirk. Izuku knew how terrifying that prospect was, not having control. It was then that Izuku realized he was far from the only one whose quirk could go out of control when his emotions took over. Kaken took a step back, stumbled a little. He swallowed thickly. Izuku grit his teeth to keep from making any kind of pain noise. He knew his face was screwed up in pain, and probably some of the jackal's overflowing anger. Izuku wanted to tell Kaken it was alright, that he understood. Izuku had caused pain to others on accident too. But he didn't trust his ability to speak right then. Kaken took another step back, his gaze drifting and then fixing on his hand, the one that had burned Izuku. He stared at his hand like it was a foreign object, like it had betrayed him. And Izuku knew that, in a way, it had. ᴇᴜᴜ-chan, Izuku ground out and Kaken's gaze snapped to him. It's F fine. I'm F fine. I hurt you. Kaken's voice sounded rough and it seemed like he hadn't meant to say the words at all. The words made it too real. You've hurt me before, Izuku reminded him. Izuku's words did the opposite of what he'd intended though. His words didn't seem to really register even. Kaken didn't relax at all, instead he took a sharp intake of breath and his whole body wound tight like a spring. Kaken was used to fighting his way out of things. But there wasn't a way to fight what had just happened though, to fight what Izuku imagined he must be feeling. Or maybe Izuku was just projecting. The pain was fading. His wrist started to feel numb and he felt a rush of lightheadedness. Izuku let out a shaky breath. Let's just get to UA, Izuku suggested. That also didn't seem to be the right thing to say. It was an accident, right? Izuku tried. Kaken said nothing, but there was a slight tilt of his head that Izuku read as assent. Once more Izuku tried to ease Kaken's churning emotions. It's fine, I hurt myself all the time. What? Kaken spat the question and blinked at him like he'd just grown a second head or something. No one has to know, Izuku explained. He figured Kaken was probably worried about what this meant for him and his place at UA. Maybe he was afraid Izuku would tell and he'd be expelled. Izuku wasn't exactly happy with Kaken, but he didn't want to ruin his life or anything. He didn't want to be the reason Kaken never became a hero. I'll go to Recovery Girl, get it fixed, I won't tell. You think I need your fucking protection? Kaken hissed, his eyes narrowing. Izuku blinked, shifted uncomfortably. Not my protection, Izuku tried to clarify his meaning, but Kaken wasn't having it. I'm not gonna run from my actions. Kaken snapped. I'm not a fucking coward. That word, coward, it stung and dug at Izuku like a thorn in his heart. Izuku swallowed. He was at a loss. Kaken made a tch noise and then grabbed Izuku by the shoulder of his jacket. Izuku almost flinched but didn't. Kaken wasn't touching him, just his uniform. Kaken dragged Izuku to the train station, dragged him into UA, and then dragged him to the infirmary. He didn't answer any of Izuku's protests or attempts at conversation except to snap shut up at one point. What happened? Recovery Girl asked, looking back and forth between Izuku and Kaken. Izuku released his death grip on his wrist and winced at the sting of fresh pain. Recovery Girl sucked in a breath at the sight. It looked worse than before if that was possible. The skin hadn't been able to blister properly, so the skin was cracked in some places and still openly bleeding. It was Izuku started, but Kaken cut him off. "It was me," Kaken told her, voice still a little rough-sounding. But he didn't avert his eyes like Izuku would have. Instead he met Recovery Girl's gaze head-on. He stopped, let out a breath. His fists clenched. "I did it. It was an accident," Izuku added quickly before Recovery Girl could get the wrong idea. "We got in an argument and he didn't mean for." "Shut up, Deku," Kaken snapped. "I don't need you defending me." Izuku could have been mistaken, but he thought Kaken sounded just a little shrill, just a little worried, just a little anxious. "Midoriya, go on over to the exam bed," Recovery Girl nodded towards the one nearest the far wall. "Bakugo, go wait in my office, I'll be contacting your homeroom teacher." Kaken nodded and went to wait in the office. Izuku was ushered by Recovery Girl over and then onto the exam bed. He didn't mean to do it, Izuku told her as she gently took his wrist and then used her phone to snap a few photos before kissing him lightly on the back of the hand. "Eat some of these," she handed him some gummies, but didn't acknowledge what he'd said. "Stay here and rest a bit. I'll be back." She went to her office. The door was closed, but Izuku thought they were probably talking. Izawa-sensei appeared after a few minutes, looked annoyed and tired. Izuku gave a small wave of greeting. Izawa-sensei just kind of glowered before heading into Recovery Girl's office. The sound of voices got louder, but Izuku couldn't make out what was being said. He didn't really hear Kaken's voice too well either, which meant he was probably actually speaking in a normal volume. It was odd to think Kaken even had an indoor voice. Izuku continued to sit on the exam bed anxiously waiting for direction. He ignored the whispers and growls from the Jackal. Glancing at the clock, he saw they still had a little time before class started. Izuku always left for school early and Kaken had gotten up early this morning to catch him. Their homeroom teacher was there with them though, so technically Izuku didn't think they could be late as long as they were with Izawa-sensei. After what seemed like forever, and certainly long enough to fray Izuku's nerves to pieces, Izawa-sensei exited Recovery Girl's office. Izuku caught sight of Kaken briefly when the door opened before Izawa-sensei closed it behind him. Kaken's shoulders were slumped and his head was ducked. It looked wrong on Kaken. Kaken was confident, nothing got him down. So why did he look so guilty? "So, Midoriya," Izawa-sensei began, running a hand through his black hair in a way that seemed to say it was way too early in the morning and school year for this kind of thing. "What happened?" "It was an accident," Izuku answered immediately. We argued and we were both mad and Kaken's quirk accidentally activated. That's all." Izawa blinked slowly at him. "Please don't expel or suspend him or anything," Izuku added. Izawa-sensei gave a low sigh and moved to lean against the exam bed beside Izuku. His dark eyes appraised Izuku carefully. Izuku chewed on his bottom lip, flexed his newly healed left wrist gingerly. "There will be consequences for Bakugo's actions," Izawa-sensei told him. Well, that did nothing to calm Izuku's clamoring anxiety. The Jackal seemed to approve though. He wants to be a hero so bad," Izuku whispered. "He'll be a good hero." He looked up at Izawa-sensei imploring. "Relax, kid," Izawa-sensei said with a sigh. "He's not being expelled or suspended." Izuku sagged with relief. Izawa-sensei snorted at his reaction. His dark eyes were searching though, analyzing. It made Izuku shift uncomfortably. "Has anything like this happened before, Midoriya?" "No," Izuku replied immediately. It was true too. Not a lie really. Kaken had never accidentally hurt him before. Aizawa's eyes narrowed, appraising. Izuku looked away. Aizawa sighed. "Come on, Midoriya. Time for class." Izuku had been looking forward to Toshinori's class all day. After the poor start to his morning, seeing Toshinori would be an absolute ray of sunshine. Kaken had missed homeroom, but had appeared after that, a little sullen, but seemingly back to normal. Toshinori made a grand all-might entrance, and it was nice to not be the only one beaming and bright-eyed when he came in. And he was having them do a practical exercise. It would also be the first time they got to see their hero costumes. Hero costumes. Izuku had tons of sketches from when he was a kid of his own hero costume. The thing was, none of them took into consideration the Jackal. Even after his quirk manifested, he'd sworn not to use it, so he always imagined his hero costume only for himself. But now he had to take the Jackal into account. Anything Izuku wore would be torn to shreds or stretched beyond repair when he transformed. Izuku had wanted to bring up his concerns with someone, but talking to his mom about how to plan to not end up naked after a full transformation just wasn't something he wanted to talk about with her. Or Toshinori. Izuku had blushed like mad when he'd even considered talking to him about it. Izuku tried to look at what other heroes with transformative quirks used, like Mount Lady. But the size-changing suit used by her was really expensive, and a whole costume made of that wouldn't be covered by the stipend provided by UA. And besides, Izuku didn't really like the idea of covering all his fur with material. He looked at heroes like Hound Dog too. His quirk wasn't transformative, but his aesthetic was similar enough to Izuku's, when Izuku was transformed anyway. In the end, Izuku wasn't happy with his design, but he'd had a time limit. So his costume was basically a pair of armored dark-colored pants and a belt. Izuku felt incredibly self-conscious in his costume. He knew he probably looked ridiculous since the pants were a little baggy, but he wasn't sure what else to do. Izuku hopped to eventually meet with the support department at UA and brainstorm what he could do to improve his costume. For now, this would have to do. On the bright side, he wasn't the only one without a shirt. Kirishima gave him a thumbs up and a bright smile. He also seemed to think the scars Izuku had on his right arm were super manly. Izuku was just glad his training had made his upper body rather built. It made him feel marginally better. Izuku thought he saw Toshinori snort when he saw him, but he covered it expertly with a cough. Then he explained the hero-villain exercise they would be doing. And how it would be chosen. Random pairs. Izuku prayed he wouldn't be paired with Kaken, either with or against. He waited with bated breath as Toshinori, All Might, dramatically drew from the box. All Might announced with flair who the first team of heroes and villains would be. Izuku sighed in relief that Kaken was part of that first group and Izuku was not. He knew Kaken probably did not share the sentiment, even after this morning. They watched each match from a control room until it was their turn. When they watched Kaken's match, Izuku wondered whether he'd have trouble using his quirk after what had happened that morning. Izuku knew it had taken him years to use his quirk again after hurting his mother accidentally. He didn't need to worry though. Kaken was the same as ever. Eventually it came to Izuku's turn. Izuku was paired with ᴘᴇᴟ. They were assigned the role of villains. Izuku wasn't exactly thrilled at playing the villain, but it was just an exercise and he could pretend that he was in reality the hero protecting the bomb from the villains trying to steal it. Yeah, he could go with that. They would be going up against Hagakure and Ojiro. Hagakure's quirk was obviously invisibility, but he wondered whether her invisibility was due to an ability to bend light, and if so, how far it extended. Right, now wasn't the time to really think about that kind of stuff though, he supposed. Ojiro's quirk was also rather obvious, his tail. It had to be quite powerful and versatile if he managed to get into the hero course with a quirk most people wouldn't think of as superheroic. Are you talking to yourself? ᴘᴇᴟ asked, giving Izuku an odd look. Izuku flushed, realizing that he had been muttering again. Oh, sorry, it was all Izuku could think to say. What floor do you think we should choose to hide the bomb? Somewhere in the middle. ᴘᴇᴟ said, and Izuku nodded his agreement. I think it might be good if we stuck together too, Izuku began slowly, gauging ᴘᴇᴟ's reaction. He was so used to fellow students ignoring him he half expected that here as well. But ᴘᴇᴟ actually hummed in assent. Splitting up would not be as advantageous. Hiding would be best, or capturing them. But leaving the bomb unattended or only protected by one of us is too risky. ᴘᴇᴟ murmured, thinking aloud but also perfectly mirroring Izuku's own thought process. If we cut the power in the building, would you be able to hide us and the bomb with your, shadow? Izuku asked. Dark shadow is more powerful in the dark, and my vision is adapted for the night as well. ᴘᴇᴟ told him. I cannot extend him to such a degree to hide the bomb, however. Mine too, Izuku grinned, then tried to clarify. My eyesight, I can see in the dark, my quirk isn't more, powerful in the, yeah. He trailed off feeling like a complete dork, but ᴘᴇᴟ didn't seem to judge him. As the villain team, they got a little extra time compared with the hero team in preparing. They cut the power, well, turned it off anyway. Then they made their way to the second to top floor with the bomb. In the end, ᴘᴇᴟ pointed out that neither Hagakure and Ojiro had flying quirks, so they'd likely have to go floor by floor from the bottom up. They used one of the middle rooms with the least amounts of windows. Unfortunately, there weren't any with none. Once the match began, ᴘᴇᴟ and Izuku were silent. With Hagakure being invisible, they'd need their other sense to find her. She would probably take points since she had an advantage in regards to stealth. Starting a short beat, tapping his fingers lightly against his leg, Izuku called on the Jackal's power. One of his ears elongated, large and thickly furred. His jackal ear twitched, catching sound his own human ears couldn't pick up on. When he didn't feel any pushback from the jackal, Izuku slowly drew on more of its power. He shifted form. Izuku knew he couldn't predict which muscle groups he'd need, so he had to do a mostly full transformation. He'd done them before successfully, but it all kind of depended on the jackal's mood that day. So far it had been mostly calm though, other than with Kaken that morning in the aftermath. But ever since Aizawa-sensei had said there would be consequences for Kaken's actions, the jackal had seemed to relax. It didn't take long for them to get near. Izuku's jackal nose twitched. He could smell them. Hagakure and Ojiro. Close. The thought rumbled in the back of his mind. They're here, Izuku told ᴘᴇᴟ quietly. His voice sounded a little odd, a little deeper, scratchier. ᴘᴇᴟ shot him a questioning look. It felt dangerous, taking the jackal's form, but Izuku was surprised how in control he felt. He still tapped a bead lightly against his upper thigh and muttered a lyric here or there, but for the first time in a long time he felt like his quirk was his own. Then Hagakure entered the room. Izuku couldn't see her, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly where she was. He wanted to warn ᴘᴇᴟ, but in doing so he would tip her off as well. So instead, he waited. Izuku made sure his gaze didn't fix on her but roved around. He didn't need his sight anyway. She was probably smiling, probably thinking this would be a piece of cake. All she had to do was get to the bomb and it would be over. A quick glance towards ᴘᴇᴟ and Izuku knew his teammate hadn't noticed her. He let her get halfway into the room before he pounced. Pivoting without warning and channeling just a little of one for all, Izuku launched himself towards her, knocking her to the ground. Hagakure shrieked and ᴘᴇᴟ was immediately on alert. Ojiro burst into the room upon hearing his teammate's cry and ᴘᴇᴟ's attention snapped to him, trusting Izuku to deal with Hagakure. Izuku pinned Hagakure to the floor, one thickly muscled leg pressed down across both of hers and both her wrists held tightly in one large clawed hand. He still couldn't see her, but it felt like she was perfectly visible with how obvious it was that she was there thanks to his jackal senses. How'd you find me? Hagakure sounded genuinely shocked. Izuku didn't plan on answering her, it was more of a rhetorical question anyway. I smell you. The dark voice hissed out from between Izuku's clenched teeth. Izuku bit back any more words from the jackal, squeezing his eyes shut and biting his tongue until he tasted blood. I hear you. The thought rumbled. Hagakure made a gasping squeak-like sound and Izuku's eyes snapped open. Blood had dripped from between his teeth, which were peeled back in a silent snarl, onto her face. Sorry. Izuku apologized immediately, almost letting go of her, but managed to stop from moving in time. It was getting hard to focus. The jackal seemed to recognize that, and for a moment Izuku felt afraid. But then the jackal retreated. It gave a kind of scoff of annoyance, but it didn't fight him. Izuku was still in control. Quickly, Izuku got out his capture tape and wrapped Hagakure as best he could. That meant she'd be out of the exercise. Izuku carefully got off of her. No fair. ᴅᴇᴜ sighed. She stayed on the ground, the capture tape wrapped loosely around her wrists. Izuku hadn't wanted to hurt her or anything by making it too tight. Izuku's attention moved off of her though and over to where ᴘᴇ'ʟ was fighting Ojiro. Well, Ojiro was mostly dodging and slowly getting closer and closer to the bomb. Ojiro was smart enough to know that he just needed to get to it rather than actually beat ᴘᴇ'ʟ in a fight. But Ojiro was outnumbered now. Ojiro, look out! ᴅᴇᴜ shouted. Izuku growled in annoyance. He supposed it made sense she'd still be able to aid her teammate even if she was captured. Ojiro threw himself to the side and Izuku missed him by only an inch, landing on all fours. Izuku's claws bit into the metal floor with a burst of green static from One for All. The sound was grating. A low wet snarl came from Izuku's throat. He hadn't meant to do it, but it epitomized his frustration at missing. Ojiro blinked, took a step back. Give up, Izuku growled. He hadn't meant to say it. His voice did sound different too, much different. Then he realized he'd stopped his beat, stopped muttering lyrics. Izuku felt the Jackal. Is that who spoke? The Jackal and not him? The moment he worried his control was shot, the Jackal stepped back though. The presence inside him grumbled, but it didn't fight for control. Ojiro didn't stand a chance against both ᴘᴇ'ʟ and Izuku. To his credit, Ojiro did try to simply dodge and make his way to the bomb, but he was cut off at every turn. Time ran out. The villain team won. Izuku didn't like the sound of it, but he was happy he had done so well. The moment time was called, Izuku released his hold on the Jackal, his form returning to his own. He was still crouched down on all fours, and when he changed back he found himself just a little out of breath and a light sheen of sweat across his body. But he controlled it. He controlled the Jackal. He'd used its power and not hurt anyone or lost control. Izuku couldn't help grinning because for once in his life things were working out okay. Maybe the Jackal wasn't so bad after all. Maybe they could be a partnership like ᴘᴇ'ʟ seemed to be with his own sentient quirk Dark Shadow. All four of them headed back to the control room for a rundown like the other matches had gotten. Great job, both teams! Toshinori boomed in his all-might voice. You each used your strengths well. He gave a thumbs up. Now, what could they have done better? Yaoyorozu raised her hand just as she had every time Toshinori asked the question after a match. Toshinori called on her again though, and her analysis always did seem to be pretty good. Still, Izuku couldn't help feeling a little something at the attention she was getting from Toshinori. ᴅᴇᴜ and Ojiro chose to take a more stealthy approach to try to reach the bomb and win that way, but they didn't take into account Midoriya's quirk, which obviously would heighten his senses, making ᴅᴇᴜ's invisibility less effective. Yaoyorozu said, her tone confident. Additionally, ᴘᴇ'ʟ appears to be a ranged fighter whereas Ojiro is a close-range fighter like Midoriya. So really, instead of sending in their stealth first, they should have sent in Ojiro to cause a distraction or at least keep Midoriya engaged, which would then allow ᴅᴇᴜ to sneak past ᴘᴇ'ʟ and reach the bomb. Her analysis was what Izuku had worried might happen. Although, he would have tried to keep his focus on ᴅᴇᴜ anyway and tried to hand Ojiro over for ᴘᴇ'ʟ to deal with. Yaoyorozu's plan was good, but Izuku thought there was a good workaround. In the end, ᴅᴇᴜ and Ojiro were just unlucky with their matchup. But that was just Izuku's opinion. He heard the Jackal's chuckle echoing in his mind. Nice analysis. Toshinori complimented. Izuku thought his smile looked just a little strained though, just as it had for most of her analysis. He had to suppress a smile as he wondered whether Toshinori actually made the same analyses as Yaoyorozu like he implied, or whether he was just piggybacking off of her intellect. This was his first time teaching after all. Izuku rubbed at his upper arms. His bare feet were cold on the metal floor. He was still in his costume. At the time he thought it would be best to not have a shirt or a jacket because it would just end up shredded. Glancing at ᴘᴇ'ʟ though, he realized a cloak would have the same effect but wouldn't end up ruined. Theoretically. Toshinori wasn't looking at him. Since he'd changed into his costume he hadn't really looked at him. Izuku frowned. It was then, after the exercise was long over, that Izuku realized ᴅᴇᴜ had been naked during the exercise. that Izuku had been pinning her. Izuku's face flushed a dark red. He scrubbed a hand over his face in an effort to hide the fact. He wasn't exactly sure why, but now he was the one avoiding Toshinori's eyes. Izuku was a little worried when class ended for the day. He was worried like he'd been the day before. But as soon as class ended, Kaken got up and left, moving with purpose towards the teacher's offices. Izuku watched him go, feeling both relieved and worried. "Remember not to forget anything today," ᴅᴜᴜ told him with a smile. Izuku blinked, momentarily confused, until he remembered his lie from the day before. "Oh, right," Izuku stammered quickly. Izuku walked to the station with ᴅᴜᴜ and Iida. With his friends, everything was looking up. He was getting control of his quirk and he was in training to become a hero. Everything seemed to be working out. It wouldn't last. Rescue training. Izawa-sensei's words sent a thrill of excitement through Izuku. This is what he longed for, what being a hero was all about, not fighting villains. That was part of it, yes, but saving people, rescuing, that was what being a hero was truly about. The bus ride was filled with lively conversation about what kind of rescue training they'd be doing. It was a new experience for Izuku, having classmates, friends, to talk to. His excitement was tempered a bit when he heard from 13 that All Might, Toshinori, wouldn't be joining them like originally planned. Izuku was very tempted to try to sneak back to the bus to get his phone out of his bag and send a text checking to make sure he was okay. But Izawa-sensei would probably have caught him, and Izuku didn't want to bother Toshinori if he was just busy. Then black mist-like portals appeared. Izuku could smell them before he saw them. He knew immediately that they were villains. The jackal raked its claws against the door angrily when the villains spoke about destroying the symbol of peace, destroying All Might. Izuku felt the same way, but winced all the same. The question was, what could he do? Izawa-sensei leapt into action, engaging the enemy, leaving 13 to protect them. A wave of darkness rushed towards them. Izuku didn't think, he just did it. His legs and arms transformed even as he looped an arm around his closest classmate Azui and leapt to the side along with Iida and several other of his classmates. Azui managed to grab Mayonetta with her tongue, dragging him out of the way as well. Izuku skidded to a halt, still on his feet. He'd gained some height from his partial transformation and Azui's feet dangled above the ground. Carefully, Izuku set her down and reassessed the situation. They'd avoided the black portal that seemed to be some kind of warp quirk, but that didn't mean the villain wouldn't try again. Iida looked conflicted, but at 13's behest he made a run for it. Everything happened so fast. Izuku watched, unable to do anything, as the black mist warp villain turned 13's quirk on her and then went after Iida, trying to stop him. Shoji came to the rescue. Then ᴅᴜᴜ. Then Siro along with Azui, both of them latching onto the metal piece around where the villain's neck probably was. Everything happened so fast. 13 was down. Iida had gone for help. Izawa-sensei was outnumbered and that freakish thing, that Numu, had pounced and was now pressing Izawa-sensei into the ground. Izuku had to do something. He couldn't just keep standing there watching. Izawa-sensei hadn't wanted them to get involved. Izuku had to choose between following his sensei's instructions or helping. It wasn't much of a decision. Izuku was going to help. He felt his body change completely as he raced forward, the jackal exploding out of him, fully consuming his frame, eclipsing Izuku's own body in its larger, more powerful form. In a single leap, Izuku was down the stairs. His vision sharpened along with his other senses. He tackled the Numu creature off of Izawa-sensei, slamming his huge frame against it. The Numu was heavy. Almost immovable, but a surge of one for all sent it flying. Izuku moved to crouch protectively over Izawa-sensei, which was easy to do in his large four-legged jackal form. Izuku used his left hand to tap a bead against the ground near Izawa-sensei's head. His sharp nail biting into the dirt but keeping him present as he focused. He had to keep focus. "Midoriya?" Izawa-sensei asked, sounding a little out of it but also kind of pissed. "Be careful and don't use your quirk on me," Izuku managed to say aloud while repeating lyrics in his mind. His left index finger continued to keep a steady beat. The Jackal's consciousness shifted against his mind but didn't press against it like usual. It wasn't fighting for control. ᴅᴇ'ʟᴟ-sensei was definitely pissed at him. "I'll handle the ᴡᴅ," Izuku told him, cutting him off. He was surprised at how confident he sounded. But then, that Shigaraki-guy had said the ᴡᴅ was made to take on All Might and Izuku had All Might's power, so yeah, Izuku should be able to at least keep it busy while Izawa-sensei took care of the other guys. Until Toshinori and the other heroes got there. Izuku couldn't keep a beat while fighting, so he started muttering lyrics instead. Before the ᴡᴅ turned back towards them, Izuku lunged for it. Izuku barreled into it once more, sending it smashing through the center fountain. Green static rippled along Izuku's form and a snarl ripped from his throat. The ᴡᴅ got up. It didn't even look hurt. Izuku let out a low growl. He didn't notice he'd stopped muttering. The Jackal waited in the shadows. Izuku's sharpened eyes took in the ᴡᴅ's exposed cranium. Weakness. But he wasn't trying to kill it. Technically it was a person with a mutant quirk, right? Except its eyes looked hollow, dead, like there wasn't anyone really there. The ᴡᴅ's body was a mass of muscles. With another burst of One for All, Izuku shot towards it again. He raked a claw across its chest. With a flash of green light, Izuku left behind several long gashes across its chest. Then the ᴡᴅ healed. It didn't even seem to have felt the momentary damage Izuku had caused. His mind raced as he tried to think what he could do to stop it. Izuku realized that the best he could hope for really was keeping it busy and off of Izawa-sensei until the rest of the faculty arrived. He hoped Toshinori stayed away. He hoped he wouldn't come. Izuku didn't think it was possible for anything to defeat All Might, but this ᴡᴅ, with its regeneration, might be able to cause some real damage. Izuku wasn't going to let that happen. The Jackal's approval at Izuku's thoughts felt dark. But it wasn't trying to fight him for control. Izuku felt the offer there though, the quiet suggestion that it would be happy to take on the ᴡᴅ for Izuku. That Izuku could just sleep. Shaking his head, Izuku made another pass at the ᴡᴅ. Even if it could heal, Izuku could keep it busy. Izuku circled it, trails of green static left behind each time he pounced, each time he slashed. He went in for another pass. Izuku miscalculated. The ᴡᴅ's hand shot out and latched firmly around Izuku's neck. Izuku choked as his throat was squeezed shut. He couldn't breathe. Scratching and clawing at the ᴡᴅ's arm and hand, Izuku tried to get it to let go. But the creature seemed to pay no mind to the bloody gashes Izuku was leaving behind. Izuku's vision started to tunnel. "Release me." Izuku blinked. The Jackal's presence clawed at the half-open door inside him. Izuku had a feeling the Jackal could have simply taken control at that point, but it was asking him instead. "Let me help." The rumbling voice hissed. Izuku gasped vainly for breath, his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. What else could he do? For the first time in Izuku's life he let the Jackal out to fight his battle. For the first time in his life Izuku let himself fall back into the darkness and sleep. He didn't cling to the doorway, didn't want to watch whatever happened next. Izuku hoped he'd made the right decision and prayed he didn't hurt anyone. Izuku gave over control to his darker nature. Aizawa watched in horror as the ᴡᴅ grabbed Midoriya by the throat. Midoriya's clawed hands scrambled and tore at the ᴡᴅ's arm, but it didn't let go. Aizawa knew he couldn't get there in time. His quirk wouldn't be able to do anything for Midoriya either. That realization sent a cold chill through him. Midoriya's green eyes rolled before finally falling shut. For one heart-stopping moment Aizawa thought he was dead. In an instant his eyes snapped back open, but they were no longer green, they were golden. Green static burst from Midoriya's form, dancing around and along his jackal body. His clawed right hand and arm drew back before slashing forward with a flash of bright green light. There was a sickening crunch. The ᴡᴅ's arm was severed at the elbow. Aizawa blinked. Midoriya twisted as he fell, landing on all fours. The ᴡᴅ's detached arm fell limp to the ground. Midoriya's right front leg, the one that was now covered in the ᴡᴅ's blood, flinched and Midoriya put no weight on it. Broken maybe, Aizawa decided. And then the Numu's arm grew back, regenerating. Midoriya didn't look perturbed by this though. Cuckoo, the deep rumbling, that Izawa could only describe as some kind of laughter, came from Midoriya. But it didn't sound like Midoriya. Midoriya's lips peeled back in a snarl as he bared his fangs at the Numu. And somehow the jackal seemed to grow a little larger. The pants he wore ripped further until the cloth fell from the thickly furred body even as a tail took shape. The jackal was huge. Izawa had to focus on his own fight. Shigaraki and Kurogyari, and some of the other villains were still conscious and fighting. But Izawa's attention flitted over to Midoriya every chance he got. The rest of his students seemed to be okay, holding their own or helping one another. Midoriya lunged and lashed out with the grace of a wolf, like a predator, and Izawa had a hard time reconciling this jackal with his student. He wasn't just slashing lightly at it before, but actively biting and clawing, ripping out chunks of the Numu's flesh. Izawa heard the crunch of bone. Izawa leapt back to avoid Shigaraki as he was forced to blink again. His eyes were dry and felt like they were on fire, but he forced himself to keep them open and on Shigaraki and on as many of the villains as he could. His other students showed up to help. Bakugo, Kirishima, and Todoroki. Most of his other students were obeying his order to stay safe, but those three seemed intent on helping regardless of what Izawa shouted at them. Izawa begrudgingly admitted to himself that it was helpful. A guttural snarl snapped Izawa's attention back to Midoriya. Midoriya shot forward in a spray of green sparks and dirt. He leapt onto the Numu's back, his claws digging into the thing's shoulders and back. And then Midoriya's jaws widened before snapping closed and onto the Numu's exposed cranium. Midoriya ripped. Midoriya tore. Midoriya ate. The Numu had stalled in its movements as its brain was shredded by bone-white teeth. The Numu fell forward, crashing to the ground. Midoriya wasn't fazed as he continued to gnaw and chew apart the brain that was starting to look more like jelly. Then there was blood. As Midoriya's elongated jackal jaw dug into the Numu's head, it passed the brain. His jaws came away wet, red, and sticky. Midoriya licked his lips, making a smacking sound as brain matter and blood dripped from his lower jaw. Izawa thought he would be sick. Behind him he was pretty sure some of his students were. Everyone was frozen, watching. Students, teacher, and villains alike. The sight was horrifying, but Izawa found himself unable to look away. "My Numu!" Shigaraki hissed angrily, though there was a tremor of horror at Midoriya's display. "You," he looked at Midoriya, who was ripping at the Numu's head more violently than before. Maybe the brain was regenerating like its arm had. Midoriya looked up sharply, fixing his yellow eyes on Shigaraki. Shigaraki stilled. Izawa felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. If Midoriya lunged for the villain, Izawa would have to stop him. That creature was one thing, but killing a person, that was something Midoriya couldn't walk away from. But after a moment Midoriya made a snorting sound and resumed pulling at the Numu's exposed head. Shigaraki was ignored. "You're not," Shigaraki began, probably wondering why Midoriya wasn't attacking him or the other villains now that the Numu was down. Midoriya's eyes snapped back to him as he pulled his muzzle out of the bloody mess of what was left of the Numu's brain. "Run if you wish," Midoriya told him, but the voice didn't sound like Midoriya at all. It was rougher, darker. It resonated with something unknown. You killed my Numu," Shigaraki murmured. His voice was so quiet Izawa almost didn't hear it. Midoriya's ears twitched as though he'd shouted. "It laid hands on me," Midoriya replied, as though that explained everything. Izawa was starting to get the feeling that either he'd misjudged who Midoriya was or this wasn't Midoriya. Midoriya had seemed intent on helping Izawa, on protecting his classmates. But now all Midoriya seemed to care about was the Numu. Jaws snapped and pulled at brain tissue and flesh. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Shigaraki scratched viciously at the sides of his neck. "With the Numu out of commission, we should go," Kurogyari murmured. Izawa activated his quirk, keeping Kurogyari from opening a portal. Shigaraki snarled. But the villain had been right. Izawa's ability to keep his eyes open was less and less each time before he was forced to blink. As soon as he did, Kurogyiri seemed to sense it. A portal opened below them and both villains escaped. Aizawa cursed. The only villains left were those Aizawa had already taken out in the ᴡᴜ. The ᴡᴜ that was still being ripped at by Midoriya. Before he turned his eyes back to that sight, Aizawa pulled his goggles down and rubbed at his eyes, trying to force some of the dryness out by making his eyes water. Then he turned to his student. He tried to ignore the wet chewing sounds. Midoriya! Aizawa called, keeping his voice from betraying the sick feeling in his gut at seeing the ᴡᴜ's brain matter splattered across the ground. Midoriya looked up, his muzzle still dripping with blood and tissue. The golden yellow eyes looked at him coldly. "The one you asked for is asleep, Midoriya." "No," the Jackal said with a wide, almost manic grin. It was as he thought, this wasn't Midoriya. Aizawa's lip thinned into a grim line and he activated his quirk. The Jackal blinked but its eyes remained yellow and its body didn't shift back. More blood dripped from its jaws. The Jackal made that same dark rumbling laughing noise. That ku-ku-ku-ku. The sound made Aizawa feel on edge. Why wasn't his quirk working? Midoriya's quirk was transformative, sure, but that transformation should be erased with Aizawa's quirk. But it wasn't. Some kind of mutant quirk then? Aizawa recalled Midoriya's quirk registration as being transformative, though he clearly had some emitter-based power as well. The registry didn't mention anything about him having a mutant quirk. But then, his registration hadn't mentioned anything about another personality or sentient aspect to his quirk either. The Jackal's eyes shifted to a figure behind Aizawa. Its lips peeled back in a snarl, or rumble like thunder echoed from its chest. Aizawa's gaze flicked to the figure. Bakugo. Bakugo stared wide-eyed at Midoriya. It wasn't fear though, or anything Aizawa would expect. It was interest that flashed in his red eyes. The Jackal though, its golden eyes were filled with what Aizawa could only label as hatred. "You!" The Jackal snarled, its gaze fixed solely on Bakugo. Aizawa moved to stand in front of Bakugo, blocking the Jackal's view. Bakugo made a sound of protest but was silenced by a sharp look from Aizawa. "Go up towards the entrance." Aizawa barked at him. Then he glanced at all the students that had arrived. "All of you." The Jackal was still over the ᴡᴜ. Its nose twitched. Aizawa saw the ᴡᴜ's brain was indeed regenerating. Slower than the rest of its muscle and tissue, but still regenerating. The Jackal ripped into it again. Aizawa had to look away. He breathed through his mouth to avoid the smell of blood. Keeping his eyes on the Jackal, Aizawa moved back up the steps, staying between the Jackal and his students who he had to occasionally snap at to keep moving. Then the door to the USJ slammed open. All Might had arrived. All Might made it to the USJ as fast as he could. The sight that greeted him made his stomach turn. There was blood everywhere. All Might's gaze whipped around wildly. He saw Aizawa. He had a gash under one of his eyes and one of his elbows looked pretty bad, but he was alive. The students were with him, all fine. He counted them. 19. Midoriya was missing. Venturing further into the building he froze. The Jackal. It was in the center of the bloody mess chewing on what looked like a severed arm. It wasn't a partial transformation either, but a full, true transformation, even greater than the first time All Might had seen it. It was huge, as big as All Might himself, and it had a tail. It hadn't noticed him yet, or at least it hadn't let on that it noticed. All Might Aizawa began, but broke off, following his gaze to the Jackal. "It's not Midoriya, and my quirk isn't bringing him back." All Might nodded and headed towards it. Aizawa made an exasperated sound. "All Might, did you hear me? That, whatever that is, it isn't Midoriya." Aizawa said, voice low, hard. "No, it's the Jackal." All Might agreed quietly. Aizawa blinked. "The what?" Aizawa asked, beginning to look irritated. One dark brow twitched. Midoriya has a sentient quirk, did Aizawa not know? He was his homeroom teacher, he ought to know. But it seemed clear now that Aizawa did not, in fact, know. "Sentient?" Aizawa repeated. Then it dawned on All Might. Did ᴜᴘ not update his quirk in the registry? He asked just a little tentatively, but he had a feeling he already knew the answer. It hasn't been updated since he first registered. Izuku confirmed All Might's suspicion dryly. All Might hadn't given it much thought. The registry. ᴜᴘ had already been registered as having a quirk when it first manifested, and One for All could blend easily enough with his own not to need any additional information added to his quirk registration. So All Might had never brought it up. Now All Might recalled that ᴜᴘ himself had seemed surprised to learn his quirk was sentient too. And ᴜᴘ probably didn't even know he could update his quirk registration. Oh! Was all Might could think to say. All Might Izuku tried again, his expression more than irritated. It'll be fine, he assured him before heading towards the Jackal and ignoring the rest of what Izuku was hissing at him. He hoped he hadn't just lied. Stepping further in and down the long set of steps, All Might was able to see a creature, for it didn't truly look human, laying nearby the Jackal, the top of its skull and head ripped apart in a mess of brain matter and blood. The snapping, gnawing sound of teeth on bone and meat being pulled apart was deafening. Still, All Might took another step forward, down into the pit with the beast. The Jackal looked up when All Might reached the bottom. Its golden eyes took in his form. It let out a low growl but didn't look like it would pounce as All Might took another, and then another step forward until he was only a few yards from it. Jackal? All Might tried, keeping his voice level. He wasn't sure what to expect exactly, and that set every nerve on edge. The Jackal stood from where it lay, though it kept its weight off its right front leg. It picked up the severed arm and dragged it along before throwing it at All Might's feet like an offering. All Might swallowed and tried not to gag. For you, my mate, the Jackal's voice rumbled, sounding pleased. He almost let out a sigh of relief that the Jackal was behaving, well, normal. All Might beckoned for the Jackal to follow him and he moved back away from the severed arm. The Jackal tilted its head in question but followed, limping slightly as it did. All Might crouched down so that he was eye level with the Jackal, who sat back on its haunches. Yellow Eye stared back, not even a hint of green. He reached out and set his hand on its head. The Jackal made a satisfied noise, nuzzling into the contact. Jackal, All Might started. The Jackal growled at his stern tone, giving him a good look at its bloody canines. The black fur around its mouth was also matted in blood. Why are you not pleased, my mate? The Jackal cocked its head. I protected us. You need to give back control, Jackal. Now, he said firmly. The Jackal's eyes searched All Might's face and it hesitated. He's in the dark, the Jackal said, and it almost sounded worried. Asleep. He's hiding. It hissed the word, like it was a curse. Coward. It spat. All Might frowned, intending on scolding the Jackal, but its expression dropped. He won't come back on his own. All Might frowned before trying to call for the boy. Can you hear me, young ᴜᴘ? The Jackal shifted, uncomfortable. A good sign maybe. All Might stroked its head, trying to keep it calm as he tried to bring ᴜᴘ back. The only thing he could think of was to try to give ᴜᴘ something to focus on, something to help pull him from the dark. So All Might started humming the tune to the song ᴜᴘ often used when focusing, then softly sang the lyrics. Izuku had several songs he used to help keep him present. All Might picked a slower one, a soothing one. After a little while the Jackal joined in, its voice wavering from the growling animalish baritone to something more ᴜᴘ. The fur started to disappear, pink skin peeking through in spots. ᴜᴘ started to come back to the surface. The fur beneath All Might's hand started to feel more like hair. ᴜᴘ's voice sounded hoarse, but it was ᴜᴘ's voice through and through, no longer the Jackal's tilt. All Might continued to softly sing along with ᴜᴘ until the boy started shivering. The boy's teeth chattered, clacking together. ᴜᴘ's clothes were long gone, shredded when he transformed, no doubt. So All Might quickly unbuttoned his shirt and draped it over ᴜᴘ's still crouching form. It was so big on him that it would cover him adequately, and All Might still had his undershirt. All Might managed to button a few of the buttons before giving up. The angle made it difficult. ᴜᴘ was still singing, though now it was little more than dry muttering. He looked up at All Might, his big green eyes were glassy and his mouth was smeared red with blood. The image was at once both beautiful and horrifying. And then ᴜᴘ fell forward, emptying his stomach violently. Blood, stomach acid, tissue, and bone fragments splattered the ground. ᴜᴘ gasped for breath, but the smell and sight of what had been in his stomach made him gag again, and he retched and coughed until there was nothing left. All Might knelt beside him, rubbing slow circles on his back. All Might, ᴜᴘ's voice was a terrified whine. He cradled his right arm gingerly and his gaze swung frantically around the USJ. Green eyes widened in horror as he took in the sight around them. What did I do? The terrified whisper made All Might's chest ache. Then ᴜᴘ saw the arm, the brain matter. Did I Keiki? No! All Might told him firmly, grabbing ᴜᴘ's head and forcing his gaze to stay on All Might's face. Anywhere but the carnage around them. There was a heavy weight in All Might's chest though, because from the looks of it the Jackal had killed. But ᴜᴘ didn't need to think about that now. They could figure it out later when ᴜᴘ wasn't covered in blood. Carefully, All Might swiftly scooped ᴜᴘ up into his arms. He kept the boy's head crushed against his chest, keeping him from looking over All Might's shoulder at what the Jackal had done. All Might held ᴜᴘ tightly and he felt ᴜᴘ's good hand clutching the front of his shirt in a death grip, a lifeline keeping him present. I let it out, ᴜᴘ murmured, horrified. I let it out. His small body trembled in All Might's arms. All Might wasn't sure what he could say. When All Might got to the front door where Aizawa and the students were, Aizawa shot him a dark, almost livid look. Some of the students were craning their necks, trying to get a look at ᴜᴘ in All Might's arms, others were avoiding looking at either of them. I think his arm is broken, Aizawa said, still glowering, but his words didn't betray what was making him so angry. All Might nodded in agreement, he'd come to the same conclusion. We should get everyone outside and away from, he didn't finish, but All Might knew what he meant. Away from the smell. The sight. It didn't take long for the other faculty members to arrive along with the police. They got everyone safely back to UA. Aizawa was taken to the hospital due to the disintegration of part of his elbow. They'd wanted to take ᴜᴘ, but he clutched tighter to All Might and curled tightly against him. It was determined that it would be alright for All Might to take him to UA's infirmary. Recovery Girl could handle a broken arm. All Might was starting to sweat though. He couldn't hold his muscle form for much longer. As soon as he got the okay, he headed back to UA with ᴜᴘ. I can walk, ᴜᴘ murmured. All Might startled at his words, surprised ᴜᴘ could tell he was having a hard time. But he didn't want to put him down. From the way ᴜᴘ still trembled it was obvious he was still reeling. All Might had to help him as much as he could. It's okay, All Might told him softly. I'll be fine. He'd said he'd be fine, but the moment he got them both into the infirmary his muscle form dropped with a burst of steam. Toshi was still strong enough to hold ᴜᴘ and ᴜᴘ didn't seem to care whether it was his muscle form or not, he just didn't want to let go. Still, Toshi set ᴜᴘ down on one of the infirmary beds. He had to carefully pry ᴜᴘ's hand away from the front of his shirt. Recovery Girl appeared in moments. I heard what happened, she said without preamble. Toshi guessed one of the other faculty members let her know prior to their arrival. His mother's been notified. ᴜᴘ flinched at her statement, the blood draining from his face. ᴜᴘ's good hand reached out and snagged the hem of Toshi's shirt. Recovery Girl checked over ᴜᴘ's arm before softly kissing it. ᴜᴘ was silent, his eyes downcast, but Toshi felt a tremor in the hand that clutched his shirt. Recovery Girl sighed, placed some gummies on the bedside before going about her business, apparently determining that her presence wasn't doing any good. ᴜᴘ, Toshi began, not sure what to say exactly, but knowing he needed to comfort him. I let it out, ᴜᴘ whispered. Villains attacked and I let it out. Toshi remembered what the Jackal had said, about ᴜᴘ going to sleep. I don't remember what happened. ᴜᴘ admitted quietly. I was being strangled and it said, and I don't remember. ᴜᴘ let out a dry sob, biting his lip, head bowed. I don't remember what I did. The infirmary door burst open. Izuku! ᴜᴘ's head snapped up. Mom? ᴜᴘ's eyes widened, his whole body tensing. His mother rushed forward, intent on getting to her son, but young Midoriya jerked back away from her. He threw himself backwards, lost his balance, and tumbled off the infirmary bed into the floor on the other side. Inko Midoriya stopped dead in her tracks, her lips parted and her eyes flashed with hurt. But Toshi understood. Toshi was quick to move to Midoriya's side and make sure he was okay after falling. He was, but his green eyes were still wide and filled with fear. A tremor ran through his body. "It's okay, young Midoriya," Toshi murmured, crouching down next to him. "I don't want to hurt her," Midoriya whispered, voice hoarse. "Izuku!" his mother called, her brow creasing. Toshi could see it in her face, the pain at not being able to comfort her son, pain at knowing that just the sight of her caused him fear rather than peace. Toshi couldn't imagine how that felt. Is he all right?" she asked quietly. Recovery Girl read the situation with ease. The 3 long scars across Inko Midoriya's face explained young Midoriya's reaction as well. So Recovery Girl quickly stepped forward and led the worried mother into her office to explain what had happened and how young Midoriya was doing, physically anyway. Some of the tension in Midoriya's shoulders dissipated when his mother was no longer in the room. Then his expression was clouded with guilt along with the fear. He clenched his teeth and wrapped his arms around himself, ducking his head into the collar of Toshinori's button-up that was still wrapped tightly around him. "Are you going to be able to go home?" Toshi asked, but he had a feeling he knew how Midoriya would react to that question. His head snapped up, green eyes becoming impossibly wide, and he took in a sharp intake of breath. The tension was back too. Toshinori placed his hand over Midoriya's, trying to ease the boy's death grip on his own arm. It seemed to help a little. I see can't," Midoriya barely got the words out before shaking his head, his hair falling over his eyes as he fixed his gaze downwards once again. Sighing, Toshi moved so he was sitting beside Midoriya on the floor, their backs against the wall. Midoriya looked up at him with wet eyes and with obvious anxiety. Toshi reached out and put his arm around Midoriya, pulling him tightly against his side. Midoriya came more than willingly, burying his head against the side of Toshi's chest. "I'll talk with Recovery Girl and your mother," Toshi said softly. "I'll see if you can stay here for the night." Midoriya nodded his thanks, burrowing himself tighter against Toshi's side. Toshi's other hand began carding soothingly through Midoriya's hair. "It'll be okay, Midoriya. It'll be okay." Toshi hoped it was the truth. The incident at the USJ had resonated deep within UA. The good news was everyone was all right. Toshi was thankful for that. Midoriya had stayed that first night at the infirmary. When the Jackal remained buried, he'd reluctantly gone home. He still feared the possibility of hurting his mother. Toshi promised he was only a phone call away. Toshi hadn't seen much of Midoriya since he'd gone home. Classes would start again soon though. It had only been a couple days since then, a weekend really, and Izawa was returning to school despite the gash he'd gotten under his eye. Other than that and his elbow, the skin of which had been partially disintegrated, he was okay too. Toshi was alone in the staff room getting some tea when Izawa entered the room, his eyes darting about as though looking for someone until they landed on Toshi. Then they narrowed. Izawa shut the door, but he didn't move from where he stood. "Izawa," Toshi greeted, not sure why he was starting to feel a little nervous. "How are you doing?" "Fine," he replied tersely. Toshi blinked, unsure as to why he was so tense. "So," Izawa began, voice tight and something murderous in his eyes. "How long, All Might?" "What do you mean?" Toshi didn't shrink under his gaze, but he sure felt like he ought to. Although, Toshi wasn't sure what he was asking about either. "How long have you been in a relationship with Midoriya?" Cold anger laced his words. For a moment Toshi didn't comprehend the question. Then he realized that the way it was asked, the force behind it, Izawa was asking. "I would never." Toshi gaped at the very insinuation. In the back of his mind a dark murmur suggested Izawa wasn't all that far off. "It called you its mate." Izawa ground out between clenched teeth, spitting the title. Anger rolled off the underground hero in waves. "No! No!" Toshi denied vehemently, a thrum of terror beating beneath his skin. Look, I got to know Midoriya before he came to UA, okay? It wasn't something he'd planned on making common knowledge, but he had to explain this. I helped him with his quirk. The first time he used it, the Jackal attacked and I had to subdue it. It said something about submitting and being a pair, and I said okay because I didn't understand what it meant. You didn't understand? Aizawa's flat expression became pinched, but it seemed like he believed him. No! Toshi exclaimed. Knowing Aizawa didn't think highly of him already, he didn't need the man to think he was a deviant too. And he wasn't. He really wasn't. It wasn't until I did some research on jackals that I realized that, well, Toshi let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. At least Aizawa didn't look murderous anymore, now he just looked annoyed. Did you explain that to the jackal? Aizawa asked, his suspicion that Toshi had not done so heavy in his voice. Toshi slumped a little more, his eyes darting to the side. Well, Toshi hadn't really thought about it since it had never come up again. He rubbed the back of his neck. No, it never really came up again. Damn it, All Might. Aizawa snapped, and for a moment Toshi thought he was going to snare him with his capture scarf. He glared, and Toshi did shrink just a little this time because his fellow hero was right, he should have taken care of this long before now. Then a thought struck him. Who else heard it call me that? Toshi asked, feeling himself pale. How many students assumed that he was taking advantage of Midoriya like Aizawa did? Probably most of the students who were paying attention. Aizawa answered, crossing his arms as a vein throbbed in his forehead. Shit! Toshi mumbled. Yeah, Aizawa agreed, letting out a long breath. I'll fix it. Toshi promised. You'd better. He growled. Toshi had promised that he would fix it, but it was a conversation he really didn't want to have. He agonized over how he should go about it until he realized he was stalling. So, with a deep sigh of resignation, Toshi sent a text to Midoriya asking to meet at the beach. Toshi barely had to wait a minute before Midoriya answered. The beach was still clean and the sun had just set. Toshi didn't like calling Midoriya out so late, especially the day before classes started back up, but he knew if he kept putting it off he'd never do it. Midoriya looked rough when he arrived. Tired and wrung out, but he still smiled brilliantly when he saw Toshi. His smile was contagious. Wayagi-san. Midoriya corrected himself quickly when he realized Toshi was in his civilian form. Young Midoriya, Toshi greeted. He frowned though, taking in his rough appearance. You haven't been sleeping. Midoriya bit his lip, but didn't lie. Not, really, no, he admitted. Toshi didn't need to ask why, he could see it in Midoriya's eyes. Midoriya continued though, I don't remember a lot about what happened at the USJ after I changed. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, twisting the material roughly. But I keep feeling that things hand around my throat, and then I keep remembering after how I'd. Midoriya looked a little green, and Toshi knew it must have been awful to wake up covered in blood with a stomach full of raw meat and tissue. Toshi wasn't honestly sure what he could say to that. He settled on, cringing inwardly at the completely inadequate response. It'll get better. He offered, hoping he was right. What happened anyway? Midoriya asked carefully. At the USJ? Toshi stilled. Toshi had read the report that included Aizawa's statement, so he knew more or less what had happened. Aizawa was pretty blunt in his explanation. Midoriya looked up at him with his big green eyes, and Toshi could tell it was killing Midoriya, not remembering what happened. But Toshi had a feeling it would be more detrimental for Midoriya to know than not to know. It doesn't matter, Toshi told him firmly. It's over and done with. Midoriya frowned, but sensed the finality regarding that subject. Anyway, so, why'd you call me out here? Midoriya asked, eyes brightening. Toshi hated to ruin things, especially with Midoriya's memories of the USJ so fresh, but he reminded himself that he couldn't keep kicking this can down the road. I need to speak with the Jackal. Toshi told him. Midoriya flinched just a little. Toshi couldn't help feeling like he was betraying the boy. Only for a minute. He tried to assure him. What if? ᴜᴘ trailed off, but Toshi knew what he meant. Toshi puffed up into muscle form, hoping that would help allay the boy's concerns at least a little. It also made him seem a little more intimidating, so the Jackal was more likely to listen, or so he supposed. I brought you back at the USJ, my boy. He reminded him kindly. It'll be alright. I shouldn't have even used it. It's not worth. I can learn to use your power myself. ᴜᴘ argued, voice laced with a light hysteria, eyes wide, pleading. All Might placed a hand on his head, stilling him, and some of the tension drained from him. It's your quirk, ᴜᴘ. All Might said. It does no good to bury it and refuse to use a power that can help others. ᴜᴘ winced and ducked his head. He understood what All Might was saying. He gave ᴜᴘ's head another light stroke. ᴜᴘ's other hand moved to lay atop All Might's. His hand was warm and looked so small compared to All Might's. It'll be okay. I promise. ᴜᴘ nodded. All Might released ᴜᴘ and stepped back. ᴜᴘ's expression was so resigned and miserable as he stripped off his jacket and shirt, that All Might opened his mouth to tell him not to do it if he really felt that uncomfortable, but he didn't have time. The Jackal burst from beneath ᴜᴘ's skin. It fell forward onto all fours in a crouch. The Jackal's jaws opened in what All Might guessed was a grin. It approached and nuzzled its head under one of All Might's hands. It felt natural to stroke the fur, but All Might retracted his hand and took a step back. The Jackal's golden eyes narrowed. Can ᴜᴘ hear us? All Might asked quietly. Jackal gave a knowing look. He cannot. All Might let out a sigh of relief at that knowledge. It was best ᴜᴘ never learned about any of this. What happened at the USJ? All Might asked. He knew he was putting off what he needed to clear up, but he also wanted to know. The Jackal cocked its head. We were attacked. I protected us. The Jackal said, sounding defensive. You killed that ᴘᴅ. All Might hissed. Well, it had tried to. Might as well have. He was just glad that when it eventually regenerated, it turned out the thing was not truly human. The examiner said it was basically brain dead even before the Jackal had ripped its brain out. Jackal's kill. The Jackal replied, tone acidic. They're predators. That's what I meant to be, my pair. All Might winced at the title. What you did at the USJ has hurt ᴜᴘ. All Might shot back. He didn't feel angry too often anymore, but seeing ᴜᴘ so emotionally hurt like that had been physically painful. And it was the Jackal's fault. I protected him. The Jackal growled. It was obviously not understanding All Might's ire. You did more than that. All Might snapped. You could have stopped when the ᴘᴅ was down. But you didn't. The Jackal flinched, growled, and looked a little guilty. He didn't come back when I was done. The Jackal murmured. He stayed in the dark, asleep. All Might almost let out a growl at how the Jackal almost seemed to be blaming ᴜᴘ for its overstepping. And that thing kept regenerating. Even its brain. If I didn't continue, it could have hurt us more. The Jackal's voice had softened, its posture curled in on itself, eyes downcast like it was ashamed. All Might let out a long sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. Don't be angry with me, my mate. Cringing, All Might once again was reminded of why he needed to talk with the Jackal in the first place. He promised Izuku he'd fix it, didn't he? Now was as good a time as any. Look, All Might began, trying to sound stern. You can't keep calling me your pair or mate. Jackal tilted its head slightly and sat back on its haunches. But that is what you are, Jackal returned, and it seemed unconcerned by All Might's words. All Might frowned, opened his mouth, but froze when Jackal continued. One day we will even have pups together. All Might felt his face flush at what appeared to be an offhand and almost wistful comment. What? All Might gaped, then composed himself. No, no. All Might shook his head, pinching the bridge of his nose again. You can't have pups anyway, you're a male. Hopefully he could make the animal see logic. All Might didn't really think it was a good idea for the Jackal to choose another mate, but All Might had to at least make it understand that they couldn't be mates. But the jackal cocked its head to the other side as if confused. "You are mistaken." All Might blinked. The jackal blinked back. "No, I'm not," All Might began. ᴅᴇʟ referred to himself as a boy, and he'd seen ᴅᴇʟ without a shirt, and he could tell from the times he'd seen ᴅᴇʟ transform that he had the same bits that All Might did. When he thought about it, he'd seen Izuku naked at the USJ. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary then. Even now, the sweatpants the jackal still wore were tight enough to outline everything. "I'm not mistaken," All Might concluded more firmly. "You are." The jackal chuckled. "Izuku is a male," it acknowledged. "I am not." All Might felt like his brain had short-circuited as he tried to understand what that meant. But All Might glanced down at the outline in the sweats. It was male. The jackal seemed to understand what All Might was avoiding saying. "I have his parts, as he had mine." She told him, sounding just a bit amused. So then, ᴅᴇʟ had both. All Might shook his head and scrubbed a hand over his face, hoping to scrub the thoughts away as well. He really did not need to be thinking about that. Be that as it may, All Might cleared his throat and felt himself start to sweat just a little. "I can't be your mate. We're not even the same species." He tried logic again, hoping it would go better this time. It didn't. "You are the same as Izuku," Jackal pointed out. "You are his mate as well. You may sire pups with him if you prefer, rather than with my form." "Wah!" All Might stammered, feeling his face flush as he tried to follow the leaps of logic the jackal seemed to be making. He's my student." "Not forever, and why should that matter?" Jackal replied easily. He's 15. He argued. "A good age for breeding." All Might blanched and choked on a gasp. Bree. All Might couldn't even get the word out in his horror. For some reason the image of ᴅᴇʟ wearing nothing but Toshi's button-down shirt came to his mind. Big green eyes and a wide smile, calling his name. He sputtered into a coughing fit and ended up deflating into his regular form. Finally he caught his breath. Wiping the blood from his mouth, he fixed Jackal with a hard stare. "No," Toshi said firmly and with finality. "What?" Jackal snarled and bristled at the cold rejection. "Why?" it demanded, sounding angry but also hurt. Yellow eyes bore into Toshi's blue, pleading and burning. "You care for him." "I know you do." To Toshi it sounded almost like an accusation, but there was desperation in the jackal's voice. "Just because you decided this doesn't mean ᴅᴇʟ. He loves you." The jackal snapped, voice raw with emotion. "Our emotions are the same. The reason I accepted you so easily as my mate was because of those feelings, our feelings, for you." The words came too fast and Toshi barely caught all the jackal's words. "But he did." Toshi could do little more than stare, mouth open. The jackal's eyes were wide, it was breathing heavier. It looked scared? Hurt? Horrified that it had admitted something like that? With a shrill cry, Jackal retreated, burying itself back inside ᴅᴇʟ. With a gasp, ᴅᴇʟ blinked and coughed, his breath coming as quick as the jackal's had moments before. What happened?" ᴅᴇʟ asked and looked up at Toshi from where he sat in the sand, shirtless. His eyes were wide and a little wet. What could he say? All Might? He looked up at Toshi with such trust. "He loves you." The jackal's words echoed through his mind. Toshi coughed again, trying to shake the thought. No, the jackal was wrong. It had to be. He looked at ᴅᴇʟ again. Bright green eyes and freckle-faced. That image of ᴅᴇʟ swallowed by his button-down shirt flashed through his mind again, sending Toshi into another coughing fit. "Are you okay?" ᴅᴇʟ asked, obviously worried. He scrambled to his feet and Toshi felt his hand lightly touch his arm. It took all of Toshi's willpower to not jerk away from the action. He reminded himself that ᴅᴇʟ was not to blame and would be hurt by such a reaction. The fault didn't really lie with the jackal either, it lay with him. "I'm fine," Toshi managed to croak out after a moment. He gave Midoriya a half-hearted smile. What Midoriya began but trailed off, his gaze sliding down to his feet. I was in the dark again, he admitted quietly. So, what? He chewed his lip. Toshi knew Midoriya felt awkward questioning what he and the Jackal had talked about, and Toshi didn't want to keep things from Midoriya. Especially things that were about him. But the knowledge that the Jackal wanted them to breed together wasn't something Toshi thought he could even voice. I asked about the USJ, Toshi answered the jumble of a question that Midoriya couldn't seem to get out. It wasn't a lie really. Toshi was just leaving out the actual pressing reason for the talk. Oh, Midoriya nodded, seemingly relieved to know what it was he missed out on. What did it say? Toshi let out a long breath and ran a hand through his messy blonde hair. That it was just protecting you. That it was behaving the way a jackal would. Midoriya nodded slowly in understanding. That was all he really needed to know. Thank you, young Midoriya. The boy blinked, momentarily confused. For being brave enough to let it out again. Midoriya's face flushed crimson and he only managed to mumble a sure and nod in response. Toshi chuckled at the reaction before reaching out and tousling Midoriya's hair. It was a habit at this point, so he hadn't consciously decided to do it. He almost froze when he realized that it was behaving familiarly like this that caused the Jackal to think of him as its mate. But the way Midoriya smiled and leaned into his touch, it was too hard to pull away. So he didn't. Toshi wasn't sure he'd actually fixed anything, but at least he'd done what he promised. He'd explained to the Jackal that they were not mates. He'd also learned some things about Midoriya he wasn't sure he wanted to know. That is, if the Jackal was being truthful. It wasn't something Toshi planned on asking Midoriya though. Instead of dwelling too long on the issue, Toshi let himself enjoy the feel of Midoriya beneath his hand. Yes. They could stay like this for at least a moment longer. What would it hurt? The prospect of going back to school after the USJ incident was terrifying. Izuku had been so wrapped up in how scared he felt that he hadn't considered, at the time, that all his classmates had seen him lose control too. It did occur to him later. The night before classes resumed. Izuku didn't get much sleep that night. Izuku would have to face his classmates. He didn't know what they thought of him now. Izuku didn't remember what had happened after he gave over control. He hadn't wanted to stick around and watch either. But no one had told him after. His mother hadn't been there and so didn't know. Toshinori wouldn't tell him anything. Izuku didn't really have anyone else to ask other than his classmates and Aizawa-sensei. And he was terrified to do that. Izuku had felt marginally better when he received messages from Ida, Uraraka, and a couple other classmates asking if he was okay after the incident. It made him feel like maybe they weren't scared of him. Maybe they didn't hate him. Izuku still worried about it though. When he arrived outside Class 1A, Izuku could hear chattering inside. Taking a deep breath, Izuku slid the door open. The chattering ceased. Izuku's heart dropped. Everyone had turned to look at him. Hi, Izuku managed a weak smile and wave. He wasn't sure what he expected exactly, but it wasn't what happened. Izuku! Uraraka launched herself towards him and gave him a big hug. You're okay? Izuku felt frozen, unable to return the gesture until she was already pulling away. No one would tell us anything and you barely responded to our messages. Oh, sorry. Izuku tried, feeling a little overwhelmed because all his classmates didn't look scared of him at all, just concerned. We were all very worried, Ida scolded lightly. Izuku vaguely remembered that Ida had gotten out of the USJ before everything happened. He didn't know what Izuku had done. Even after Izuku swallowed, unable to finish the sentence, largely because he wasn't exactly sure what he'd done. He just remembered the blood, tissue, and severed arm he'd woken up to. All Might and Aizawa-sensei told us it wasn't you, Azui said in answer. We didn't know your quirk was sentient. Ashido continued. She seemed a little wary, but not scared, and that was something. Tokoyami was also watching him carefully, but differently from the others. Ashido stared at him, waiting. Izuku realized this was his chance. What exactly happened? After I changed? Izuku asked carefully, only stumbling a little over his question. What did I say about socializing? Izawa-sensei asked dryly, making everyone jump. He'd appeared out of nowhere. There's 3 minutes left until class starts. Ashido pointed out. 3 more minutes we could be having class. Izawa-sensei shot back. Everyone went to their seats and Izawa-sensei started class early. His dark eyes watched Izuku carefully. Izuku didn't get another chance to ask about what had happened. He'd get a chance at lunch though. Izawa-sensei knew that too. The bell rang for lunch. Midoriya, Izawa-sensei called and then gestured for him to approach. Izuku walked slowly up to where Izawa-sensei was at the front of the class. The few students that had lingered rather than heading straight to the cafeteria scurried out into the hall when Izawa-sensei shot them a look. Then he turned back to Izuku. Don't ask your classmates about the USJ. Izuku blinked. Izawa-sensei was so blunt about it. Biting his lip, Izuku wanted to argue how else was he supposed to find out what happened, but then, the answer was right in front of him. What happened, Izawa-sensei? Izuku asked, trying to not sound as desperate as he felt. I don't think that's something you need to know, Midoriya. Izawa-sensei told him. Izuku tensed, a feeling of irritation crawling up his spine. Of course it was something he needed to know. You're the kind of person that will dwell on something you can't change, build it up worse than it was and let it consume you. Izuku opened his mouth to argue but nothing came out. You'll be useless as a hero if you're like that. Izawa-sensei finished flatly. Izuku's mouth snapped shut and he felt himself flush from shame. A worthless hero. That's what he'd be if he let stuff like this get to him. But Izuku wasn't exactly great at just letting things go. Still, maybe Izawa-sensei was right. If he never used the Jackal again then it didn't matter anyway. Okay, Izuku replied quietly. Good. Izawa-sensei said, then eyeing Izuku critically he asked, Has All Might spoken with you? His eyes were keenly fixed on Izuku's reaction. Yes. Izuku answered honestly, though he was confused as to how and why Izawa-sensei knew Toshinori had called him out to speak with him. Izawa-sensei seemed to relax just a little though, and nodded as though satisfied. Good. Izawa-sensei said, and Izuku felt like it was his dismissal. As he turned to leave though, Izawa-sensei spoke, Oh, and Midoriya? Izuku looked back at him. Update your quirk in the registry. Izuku nodded, feeling his face coloring in embarrassment before hurrying out into the hall where he found Iida and ᴅᴘᴇ waiting for him. Ready? ᴅᴘᴇ asked with a smile. Yeah, Izuku smiled back. The three of them headed to the cafeteria. Izuku didn't ask any more about the USJ incident. Midoriya? Izuku looked up from packing his backpack when he heard Tokoyami's voice. School was over for the day, although Izuku was lingering since he planned on going to the faculty room before heading home. The room was mostly empty except for a few students still getting their things together. He hadn't expected Tokoyami to approach him. Hi Tokoyami, did you need something? Izuku asked, feeling incredibly awkward for some reason. Maybe it was because they hadn't talked a whole lot. Sure, they'd been paired for the battle training, but it wasn't like they were friends. I wanted to tell you that I understand. Tokoyami said quietly. Izuku blinked. The way you walked in this morning, shadowed by fear and guilt, it was clear to me you thought we, your classmates, would be afraid of you after seeing your quirk take control of you at the USJ. Izuku's face paled because Tokoyami was absolutely right and was laying bare everything Izuku had felt. He clenched his teeth to keep his lower lip from trembling as he tried to figure out where this was going. Except, Tokoyami didn't look afraid or angry or anything. Yeah, I guess that's how I felt. Izuku finally said, voice just a little strained. I understand how you feel. Izuku's eyes widened. Tokoyami sounded quiet still but also very genuine. He was sincere. Izuku wasn't sure whether he just thought he understood or whether he actually did before Izuku remembered that Tokoyami's quirk was sentient too. Izuku wasn't quite sure it was the same though until Tokoyami spoke again. My quirk, Dark Shadow, ᴘᴇᴟ paused, took a breath. It can be hard to control when I get overly emotional and especially in the dark. His admission made Izuku's legs feel wobbly, but he was frozen in place. It's taken control before. I've hurt people, not on purpose, but... You're like me, Izuku breathed, not really realizing he had spoken aloud until ᴘᴇᴟ nodded grimly. He thought he heard the jackal scoff behind the door, but Izuku ignored it. I was in Quirk counseling for a long time after my quirk manifested. I had to learn how to control it properly, and not let it control me. ᴘᴇᴟ continued. Anyway, I wanted you to know you're not alone, that I'm not afraid of you, and that if you want to talk, I'd be happy to listen. Izuku felt pressure building behind his eyes, that familiar burning that threatened to fill his eyes with tears. But he managed to hold them back. He didn't want ᴘᴇᴟ to think he was a crybaby. Izuku swallowed thickly and his voice came out rough. Thanks. That means a lot to me. ᴘᴇᴟ smiled and said goodbye. And then Izuku was alone with his thoughts. Logically, Izuku knew there were other people with dangerous quirks, with sentient quirks, but he hadn't really considered that they had the same problems that he did. But ᴘᴇᴟ was similar to him. Maybe not the exact same, but similar enough to know exactly how he felt. It made Izuku feel warm. It also made him want to cry. Whether it was to cry in relief or sadness that someone else had to go through something similar, Izuku wasn't sure. Izuku rubbed at his eyes, catching a stray tear or two, and took a deep breath. He wasn't quite done for the day. Izuku headed towards his destination, towards Toshinori. Izuku stood outside the faculty room, his hands fidgeting nervously as he thought about how he should phrase what he needed to ask. Izuku decided he couldn't keep standing there though. He was bound to be noticed and questioned as to why he was still on school property when classes had ended for the day. Taking a deep breath, Izuku knocked lightly on the door. He heard a muffled coming through the door and Izuku slid it open. Toshinori looked up from where he sat hunched over a desk going through assignments. He blinked owlishly at Izuku for a moment before he righted his posture and cleared his throat. Young Midoriya, Toshinori greeted. He was in his normal form, probably not having expected any students to still be around, not that they'd recognize him. What can I do for you? My mom, she wanted me to invite you to dinner, Izuku blurted out before trailing off, his face flushing crimson. He wanted to bury his head in his hand or give himself a smack. After planning and telling himself to ease into the offer, he instead word vomited his question. Despite his botched invitation, Toshinori answered. Tonight? Toshinori asked, blinking. It's rather last minute. Oh, well, whenever really, Izuku mumbled, gesturing vaguely with one of his hands. He was pretty sure his mom meant just sometime, not necessarily that night, but Toshinori seemed to be thinking rather than listening to Izuku's non-answer. I'm free tonight, Toshinori assured him. Izuku blinked. I wouldn't want to intrude though. I'm inviting you. Izuku said quickly. You wouldn't be intruding. Toshinori smiled softly at his reaction. It made Izuku's chest ache uncomfortably. The jackal was eerily silent. Let me just get my things together and I'll be ready to go, Toshinori told him as he turned back to getting his things on his desk tidied up. Izuku's mouth almost fell open. Not only had Toshinori agreed to have dinner with him, but he was going to walk him home too. Izuku was quick to get out his phone and text his mother. He phrased his message as a question, hoping she wouldn't mind if he invited Toshinori for dinner that night. She didn't. Izuku let out a small sigh just as Toshinori finished up. How are you holding up? Toshinori asked, giving him a sideways glance as they walked to the train station. They'd taken the back gate again to avoid running into anyone. Not that many would recognize Toshinori as being All Might. Izuku was silent. He figured Toshinori would ask him about that. He tried to get more sleep so he wouldn't look as bad as he had when they met at the beach, but there were still dark circles under his eyes. Fine, I guess. Izuku shrugged, looking pointedly at his feet. Sometimes he still saw the USJ in his dreams. Still felt the Numa's hand around his neck squeezing the life from him. Worse were those dreams that included what he had woken up to after. The blood. The severed arm and splattered brain matter. Izuku shivered. Izuku? Toshinori called softly. He sounded worried. I'm fine. Izuku said, clearer this time. Really? He looked up and smiled at Toshinori as if to emphasize just how fine he was. After that, Toshinori asked him about classes and other innocuous topics. Izuku was eternally grateful. It was easy conversation until they reached Izuku's apartment building. Izuku! Yagi-san! His mother greeted them with a bright smile. Nice to see you again. Izuku's gaze flitted between them. The way she said it, it was almost as if. Yes, Izuku dear, I've met with Yagi-san more than once. His mother said dryly, guessing his thoughts with ease. I wanted to get to know the man training my son. All right, Izuku stammered, rubbing at the back of his neck and looking pointedly away. There was an odd feeling of tightness in his chest at learning Toshinori met with his mother on some kind of regularish basis. Izuku shook his head, clearing those thoughts. Izuku led Toshinori inside into the kitchen. His mother had dinner on the table already. It looked lovely. Izuku sat next to Toshinori. His mother spoke easily with Toshinori. It was nice seeing them get along, but it also made something beneath Izuku's skin itch. Seeing him smile at her nodded Izuku, and he didn't understand why. He should be happy his mom got along with Toshinori. The sports festival will begin soon. Toshinori commented, nudging Izuku with his elbow lightly when he noticed Izuku had fallen silent. They're still having it? His mother asked, brow creasing. Even after everything with the USJ? Her voice climbed an octave, evidence of her nervousness. It's perfectly safe, Toshinori replied. There'll not only be those pro heroes that are teachers at UA present, but many other pro heroes as well. He turned from Izuku's mother to Izuku. Are you looking forward to it? Why yeah, Izuku answered and tried to smile, but it felt more like a grimace. He was looking forward to it, really. Sort of. He'd sworn off using the Jackal ever again and still couldn't control one for all on his own, so he couldn't really use that either. So yeah, he looked forward to competing without being able to use either of his quirks. Really? The pro hero teachers, huh? His mother mused, then made an excited noise, eyes sparkling. Do you think All Might will be there? Toshinori broke into a violent coughing fit. His mother gasped and quickly ran to the kitchen to grab some napkins. Izuku touched Toshinori's back lightly as he hunched over coughing. So Toshinori had told her he was training Izuku, and she knew he worked at UA, but he hadn't shared his true identity with her. That made the tightness in Izuku's chest dissipate just a little. Here. His mother ran back in, holding out the napkins. Toshinori took them gratefully. Izuku just barely saw the flash of blood before Toshinori was balling up the napkins and shoving them in his pocket. Izuku frowned. Are you okay? Izuku asked. Just fine, my boy. Toshinori assured him with a weak smile. This is, pretty normal for me, I assure you. He told Izuku's mother, who was still fretting. So, you're a fan of All Might, I take it? Toshinori asked, changing the subject. Oh, well, I think everyone is, she said blinking. Then she grinned. There was something teasing glinting in her eyes though. Then her gaze landed on Izuku. He gulped. Speaking of All Might fans, you should see Izuku's room. Mom! Izuku exclaimed, horrified, but trying to hide it. She didn't know Toshinori was All Might, so she didn't realize just how much more embarrassing this would be for Izuku. Toshinori looked back and forth between Izuku and his mother. Go, show Yagi-san. His mother teased as she started to collect the dishes from the table. I need to clean up anyway. I could help, Toshinori began. After you just had a coughing fit? She cut in, shaking her head. I don't think so. Go. She shooed them both off. Izuku wasn't sure he could get out of this. Part of him didn't want to. Toshinori would ask about it later anyway. True, Toshinori knew Izuku was a fan, but he didn't know exactly how big of a fan he was. Izuku swallowed, but got up and gestured for Toshinori to follow. Toshinori shot him a questioning look, but all Izuku could do was sigh and lead him to his bedroom. The nameplate on his door, with its All Might bangs, was just a small taste of what lay inside. Izuku opened the door and flipped on the light switch. So, this is it, Izuku gestured and gave a weak laugh. Oh. Toshinori blinked. Izuku felt his face heating up. His walls were covered in All Might posters, his desk covered in All Might merchandise, and even his bedspread was in All Might colors. Yeah, Izuku was a fan. Actually, no, fan was not strong enough of a word really for what Izuku was. He worried about Toshinori's reaction, a ball of anxiety tumbling around his insides. Eating dinner right before this had not been a good idea. Toshinori snorted. Izuku blinked, his face paled. Toshinori let out a chuckle. Izuku started, his voice small and a little higher than normal. He tried to think about what he could possibly say. Forgive me, my boy. Toshinori said though, a wide grin splitting his face. It's just, of all the people in the world, I managed to find my biggest fan and make him my successor. Izuku smiled at that, even laughed a little. It was a little funny. The extent of Izuku's, obsession, he supposed was the only word to describe it, didn't seem to creep Toshinori out or anything. That was good. Toshinori looked around Izuku's room, really studying some of the merchandise like he'd never seen some of it before. Which, maybe he hadn't. Izuku walked over and took a seat on his bed. He couldn't help the soft smile that tugged at his lips because Toshinori looked like he was having fun. Finally, Toshinori came and sat next to Izuku on the bed. Their hands were almost touching. Izuku felt his heart speed up just a little. The jackal was still quiet. Not that it mattered. Izuku hoped to never feel the jackal again. As if guessing where his thoughts had gone, Toshinori asked, "You haven't let the jackal out since that night, huh?" Izuku shook his head. He hadn't. Not even for class exercises. But Toshinori probably knew that. Aizawa-sensei might have mentioned or asked about it. Looking up from their hands, he met Toshinori's gaze. Seeing Toshinori usually had a way of making everything better. And it did. Mostly. What was strange was the turmoil Izuku suddenly felt coming from the jackal. Toshinori had always been a soothing, calming presence, but the jackal wasn't feeling either of those things. Izuku shoved back against it. He didn't care how it felt. He wasn't ever letting it out again. He'd done it for Toshinori, because he'd asked to speak with it. And because Izuku wanted answers just as much as Toshinori did about the USJ. Izuku didn't really get any. Not really. What had he really expected though? This was the jackal after all. I'm not going to use it again, Izuku told him. Toshinori knew immediately what he meant. Do you really think that's a good idea? Toshinori asked him softly. I can learn to control one for all on my own, Izuku began, but Toshinori shook his head. That's not what I mean. Toshinori turned towards Izuku, his fingers brushed against Izuku's on the bed. Keeping it trapped isn't going to make it go away. Running from your quirk isn't. I'm not running, Izuku said, hating how there was a light hysteria to his denial. And he'd cut Toshinori off too. Coward. Izuku flinched. Then realized it hadn't been the jackal that had whispered the word, it was his own mind hissing at him. Izuku pulled his hand away to clasp them tightly in his lap. But then he felt Toshinori's hand lightly touch his back, trying to help him just as Izuku had tried for Toshinori earlier. Sorry, Izuku murmured. Toshinori's hand moved in small circles on his back. It was as Izuku looked towards his desk that he saw it. Toshinori's shirt. The white button-down shirt that he'd let Izuku borrow at the USJ. The one he hadn't given back yet. The one still draped over the back of his desk chair. Izuku went still. He hoped Toshinori wouldn't notice. But it was too late. Toshinori had taken note of Izuku's stillness and followed his line of sight. I was going to give it be back. Izuku stammered quickly, face flushing. Toshinori chuckled at his reaction, then tousled his hair. Keep it, Toshinori said with a smile. His expression soft and open, before something Izuku couldn't name crossed his face. Toshinori looked away. Coughed. We should go see if your mother needs any help. Oh, all right. Izuku frowned as he watched Toshinori withdraw. He got up without glancing back at Izuku and headed out of Izuku's room and towards the kitchen. Izuku followed. They had little conversation after that. Toshinori was a little quieter, a little more closed off. It bothered Izuku, but he didn't think it would be appropriate to ask him about it, especially in front of his mother. He hoped Toshinori was feeling okay. Toshinori said his goodbye and Izuku and his mother got ready for bed. Izuku rubbed a towel through his wet hair as he came back into his room after a shower. He was tired, but didn't relish the idea of sleeping really. Maybe he'd be lucky and not have any dreams. His eyes caught Toshinori's shirt that still hung over the back of his desk chair. Izuku took Toshinori's shirt in his hands, bringing it to his face. It still smelled faintly like Toshinori. It gave Izuku a feeling of being safe. He'd slept in it that first night after the USJ. Izuku clenched the fabric, bit his lip. Was this creepy? His behavior? It was almost like being held though, being wrapped in Toshinori's shirt. Izuku felt safe, protected. Was that wrong? Weird? The jackal raked a claw across the door inside him. Izuku flinched. He didn't care if it was weird, he just needed to feel safe. Taking off his t-shirt, Izuku pulled on the white button down. It was huge on him, falling all the way to his knees. Wrapping it around himself, he got into bed. Izuku pulled the collar up so his cheek lay against it, so his nose was pressed against it. He breathed deeply and fell into a dreamless sleep. Toshi watched the sports festival with a frown. ᴜᴘ wasn't using his quirk. Not the jackal, and not one for all. He'd managed to win the race with his own ingenuity, which Toshi had felt a swell of pride in knowing that ᴜᴘ was his student. His successor. Not that Toshi had any illusion that that wasn't all pure ᴜᴘ. Still, it was nice to see him succeed. ᴜᴘ looked so determined. Determined to do well. But also determined not to use his quirk. He hadn't used one for all without the jackal's natural inhibitions keeping him from breaking anything before, and he wasn't trying now. Toshi had little to do other than watch. That and think about his conversation with the jackal. Ever since the jackal had made the claim that Izuku loved him, Toshi had been watching the young man more closely. What he saw made him feel mildly worried. ᴜᴘ's eyes brightened when he saw Toshi, and his smile always widened. He always had time to spend with Toshi, and he always happily accepted his lunch invitations. Maybe he was reading too much into things. Yeah, that sounded more right. Besides, even if ᴜᴘ had some kind of crush on him, there was no way he'd ever admit it or confess to Toshi. So everything would be fine. Right? The problem he was finding though lay with himself rather than ᴜᴘ. Really, ever since he'd learned that the jackal had determined he was its mate so long ago, Toshi had found himself just a little more attentive towards his own feelings regarding ᴜᴘ. He'd just never really examined them very closely until recently. What he found was something he would never admit to. Not out loud. Not even to himself. Because it was wrong. He found early on that his own eyes shone brighter and his own smile was more real than it had been in a long time at just the sight of ᴜᴘ. Spending time with ᴜᴘ was always the best part of his day. Just being in his presence, talking, it was enough. It was calming and soothing and gave Toshi a sense of peace he hadn't had since before Nana's death. Toshi supposed he was allowed to objectively think of ᴜᴘ as cute or even handsome. The young man had a nice body. Toshi cringed and viciously batted the very inappropriate thoughts away immediately. Of course his mind treated him to that image of ᴜᴘ in his button-down shirt again. It hadn't helped that he'd seen that ᴜᴘ had kept his shirt, which had his brain teasing him with the idea that maybe ᴜᴘ slept in it. Toshi felt sick again at the thought, at how the thought made him feel. What was wrong with him? He'd never thought of himself as ever turning into some kind of predator, but that was how he was starting to feel. It wasn't a good feeling. There was a break between the race and the cavalry battle. Toshi took the time to go get some water. He hopped the short walk and change of scenery would force such thoughts away. In any case, it should distract his mind from thinking about his successor. The staff room was empty as Toshi made his way over to the small mini fridge in the corner. He got a bottle of water. Midoriya probably needed some water too. Probably tired after that race. Toshi shook himself. He should not be thinking about Midoriya. Toshi let out a long depressed sigh. Quite a sigh there, All Might. Toshi startled, almost dropping the bottle of water. He turned to see Principal Nezu in the doorway. Toshi hadn't even heard him open the door. The principal could be scary quiet when he wanted to be. Something on your mind? Nezu asked, sliding the door closed behind him and walking over to get his own bottle of water. Toshi considered it. Should he confide in Nezu? He probably wouldn't judge him too harshly, he wouldn't betray his confidence, and it wasn't like he'd done anything illegal. But Toshi still wasn't sure he wanted to even say his thoughts out loud. But he was going crazy thinking about this all by himself. Chewing on his lip, Toshi decided maybe he could ask for advice without divulging too much. Toshi began but trailed off. How was he even supposed to complete that sentence? Cringing, he continued. I've been having feelings towards someone that I shouldn't. And I'm not sure what to do. His admission hung in the air like a dark shroud as Nezu gingerly uncapped his bottle and drank. The principal didn't seem perturbed or affected at all by Toshi's words. It made Toshi feel nervous. You're talking about Midoriya, yes? Nezu asked easily. Toshi blanched, his mouth falling open and his eyes comically wide as he wondered how Nezu had known. A cold fear ran down his spine as he wondered whether he was that obvious. He hoped Nezu was just that smart. I wouldn't. Toshi stammered quickly, but wasn't able to even get a sentence out. Calm down, Nezu waved a paw placatingly before padding over to one of the teacher desks, scurrying up the side and seating himself on the edge. You feel love for him, yes? Toshi wasn't sure he really could calm down, but he tried. He nodded and fidgeted with the water bottle in his hands. Love. Was that it? It felt right. It felt wrong. I don't know what to do, Toshi admitted quietly. Nezu made a humming noise. Have you considered your feelings are not what you think they are? Nezu asked, his tone still amicable and easy. Toshi blinked, confused. You have lived most of your life alone, correct? Toshi gave a half nod. He'd always distanced himself from people, even his friends. It was safer that way. You lack casual touching and understanding. But you found that with Midoriya, didn't you? I don't understand what you're getting at, Toshi said, brow furrowed. Nezu was right, of course. He recognized early on that he enjoyed ruffling Midoriya's hair just to feel another person, just to have that contact, that connection. Perhaps what you have labeled as love is not love at all but just the natural result of being around someone who has consistently shown you positive attention and comfort you so sorely long for. Nezu explained. Toshi wasn't sure why it felt like there was a weight on his chest. If what Nezu was saying was true, then it meant it wasn't Midoriya that Toshi felt so strong about but rather the role Midoriya filled. Could he have had these kinds of feelings for Naomasa or Mirai had it been them rather than Midoriya that provided those things? That didn't sit right with Toshi though. It felt wrong. He couldn't picture anyone filling that role other than Midoriya. But maybe that was just all in his head. Was Nezu right? Were his feelings just a result of confusion on his own part? A lack of emotional intelligence? Toshi didn't like it. But it eased the guilt he felt, the fear that there was something severely wrong with him for feeling this way towards Midoriya, a child. So as much as he wanted to deny it, to say his feelings were true, Toshi also clung to the idea that the feelings weren't in fact real. Because then at least it meant he was still sane, still a good and decent person. Letting out a shuddering breath, Toshi gave Nezu a weak smile. Thank you. I could be completely wrong, of course. Nezu chirped cheerily in reply. Toshi gave a wan smile but decided the principal was probably right. Toshi made it back to the stadium to watch the end of the cavalry battle. He watched with a feeling of pride as ᴜᴘ made it to the individual fights. Throughout he kept a constant incessant reminder in his mind that his other feelings, what he now labeled as darker feelings, were merely confused. Ojiro had told Izuku that Shinso's quirk involved speaking in some way. Izuku remembered that Ojiro told him not to answer any questions, not to say anything. But Shinso was saying such terrible things. And Izuku had learned to speak up since coming to UA. Once in his life he had learned to bite his tongue and keep his opinion to himself. But he couldn't do that anymore. He tried, he really did. He tried not to answer, to rise to Shinso's bait. That's not. Izuku barely had the words out of his mouth before he realized his mistake. Shinso grinned widely. Izuku's mind went blank, receding. He wasn't behind the door. He wasn't in the dark. It was different. Being there but not there. He could still see everything that happened, but he wasn't in control. Neither was Shinso. Because Izuku had been the only one who answered Shinso's question, the only one who was locked away behind that invisible barrier. Izuku's uniform ripped apart as his body exploded into a mass of dark and green fur, sharp claws, and gnashing teeth. The jackal was out. Shinso's eyes widened even as the deep, ominous ᴜᴜ rumbling from the jackal's chest. Izuku panicked. The jackal's ears flicked, its jaw opening to flash its sharp teeth. Its nose twitched. It could smell Shinso's fear. So could Izuku. The last time the jackal had been truly out in a fight it had ripped apart Inumu. And Izuku could feel it, the rolling emotions, the hunger, the need to feed on flesh now that it had had a taste. Or maybe it was just pissed about something. But no, Izuku couldn't help but believe the worst in the jackal. The jackal lunged. It launched itself towards Shinso before the other boy could even open his mouth. Midnight seemed to realize something was wrong though. Her whip tore through the air towards the jackal. But the jackal with its superior hearing and sense of smell saw it coming. It dodged to the side, hardly pausing before leaping into the air again. Shinso tried to turn. Tried to run. He didn't have a chance. The jackal pounced on Shinso. Its massive weight and powerful muscles threw Shinso to the ground beneath it. Claws bit into Shinso's arms, pinning him to the concrete platform. Izuku heard the crunch of bones. Izuku desperately clawed at the invisible barrier that was keeping him from moving, keeping him from controlling his body. Izuku slammed against it over and over, the mind control preventing him from acting. But Izuku couldn't break it. Shinso let out a cry of pain even as the jackal reared back, jaws snapping. Pain like nothing Izuku had ever felt before washed through him. The jackal howled as its body melted off of Izuku's form. Staggering backwards and off of Shinso, Izuku fell onto his haunches a few feet back. His body was slick with blood, fur, and bone fragments. Izuku's whole body throbbed. His stomach lurched and he fell forward, vomiting up what little he had in his stomach. Izuku coughed, spat. When he raised his head he saw Izawa-sensei, eyes still focused on Izuku as he crouched protectively over Shinso, who was similarly covered in the jackal's remains. Izuku felt ill again. Panic and sick rose like bile and he barely swallowed down the small amount of stomach acid he had left. Izawa-sensei was still looking at him, his quirk still activated, but he looked surprised. Shinso groaned, but managed to sit up. Izuku's heart was thundering in his own ears. He thought he saw Izawa-sensei's mouth moving, but Izuku couldn't make out the words. His eyes caught on Shinso again, his arms had deep punctures in them from the jackal's claws. Izuku's mother's face flashed in his mind's eye and he felt sick again. "I'm sorry." Izuku couldn't help it. He ran. He turned tail and ran as fast and hard as he could. Even as the jackal snarled coward over and over he ran. Not until he was halfway to the locker rooms did he slow down. He leaned against the wall panting. His body still hurt. The jackal had created new bone and muscle for its form that was then ripped from Izuku's form beneath instead of sinking back in, and it hurt. The fear and panic clawed at him too, almost as bad as the physical pain he felt. Izuku looked down at his hands. Covered in blood. His own blood or the jackal's he knew, but he felt like some of it had to be Shinsu's too. Izuku gagged. Midoriya. Izuku's head jerked up to see Toshinori running towards him. He was in his normal form and looked worried. Fear scraped at Izuku, raw and harsh, digging into him like the jackal had into Shinsu. Izuku took an involuntary step back and Toshinori froze in place. For some reason seeing Toshinori didn't give him that bone-deep feeling of peace like normal. Instead he felt anxiety tingling beneath his skin. The jackal was wary, scared and anxious. Midoriya? Toshinori kept his tone level, voice soft. It was so much more that Izuku deserved. I didn't mean to, Izuku managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. He could taste blood on his lips. Izuku felt bile rise in his throat again and leaned against the wall again as he swallowed it back. Toshinori was next to him in a flash, his hands hesitant but there to support Izuku. I can't go back there. You don't have to, Toshinori assured him before gently guiding him down the hall to the locker room. It was empty, everyone still watching the matches. Toshinori seated Izuku on a chair in the empty room and disappeared briefly only to return with some towels. Izuku flinched when Toshinori began carefully wiping away the blood from his body. Toshinori paused briefly when he did but then continued, slower and more delicately. It was then that Izuku realized the only thing he was wearing were his gym pants. They were a tattered mess, but at least they covered him. Izuku couldn't seem to find it in him to care though, even as he felt All Might's warm hands brush his bare torso every now and then as he tried to wipe away the blood. I'm sorry, Izuku murmured, voice rough like he'd been screaming. And he realized he had. When he was trapped behind the barrier Shinsu had put in his mind he'd screamed and fought but none of it had mattered. None of it had made a difference. Shinsu will be alright, Toshinori told him quietly. His wounds didn't look that bad. Nothing Recovery Girl can't fix. He shot Izuku a reassuring smile. It did not have its intended effect. I tried. Izuku managed through a tight throat. Tried to stop it. It wasn't the S same, it wasn't the D dark but I was trapped. All I could do was W, watch even as tried to G get C control. It's okay, Toshinori's voice was so gentle. You're in control now. No. Every time I think I have control, Izuku whispered, not intending to really say the words aloud but they fought their way out his tight throat anyway. I find out that I don't. I give the Jackal even an inch in it. Everything was blurry and it was when his words became sobs that Izuku realized he was crying. Again. In front of Toshinori. What was wrong with him? Izuku raised an arm intending to try to wipe away the tears but his arm was still tinged red from blood. He hiccuped and curled in on himself, drawing his knees up so he could bury his head in them. Toshinori's hand rested on his head. His large warm hand slowly pushed until Izuku's head wasn't buried anymore. Izuku's vision was still blurry, eyes wet. Toshinori was smiling softly at him though. Izuku hiccuped again. Come on, Toshinori offered his hand. Izuku took it without question. Carefully, Toshinori pulled him to his feet. He led Izuku to the shower area. You should rinse off, at least. He told him. I'll be just outside when you're done. Toshinori had turned to leave and Izuku's hand had acted all on its own. It grabbed onto Toshinori's fingertips. For a heart-stopping moment Izuku feared it was the jackal, but then he recognized that he himself didn't want to be alone. Don't leave, Izuku's voice sounded as broken as he felt. Toshinori tensed, looked away, then let out a long breath. He didn't leave. Izuku didn't let go of his hand. Izuku reached out with his free hand and turned on the shower. He didn't care that he still had his tattered gym pants on, they were covered in blood anyway. Toshinori stood to the side, out of the spray of warm water. Toshinori's hand felt warmer than the water, even as the heat from the shower caused clouds of steam to form around them. Izuku stood there. Toshinori made a kind of soft exasperated noise. Before Izuku could ask about it, Toshinori's free hand moved to Izuku's head. Long thin fingers carted through Izuku's hair, helping the water remove blood and fur from his hair. Even after his hair was surely clean, Toshinori's hand remained, threading instead of carding before his hand lowered to cup his cheek. Toshinori's thumb wiped away water and, if Izuku was being honest, tears from one of his eyes. Izuku couldn't help it. He stepped out of the spray, let go of Toshinori's hand, and wrapped his arms tightly around Toshinori's waist. He buried his head against his chest and just held tight. He felt bad for getting Toshinori's suit wet, but Toshinori didn't seem to mind. He just held him closer, his arms a promise of safety and protection, and told him everything was going to be okay. Toshinori didn't know what he could do to help young Midoriya. He'd taken such great steps towards controlling his quirk back when they'd started, but now, after the USJ incident, Toshinori felt like they were back at square one. No, actually, they were somehow even further back. Square -10, maybe. He was sure his inability to figure out what to do stemmed from his inadequacies as a teacher. Toshinori had a couple choices though in figuring out what to do next. All of which involved asking a fellow teacher. Briefly, Toshinori considered writing to Gran Torino, but a shiver of fear ran down his spine at the thought. Still, maybe he'd just put that idea in his back pocket for now and come back to it later. Toshi was in the faculty room, not grading papers but trying to figure out what he was supposed to do when Aizawa entered. It was early still, plenty of time before class. Toshi had gotten there early in an attempt to catch up. Aizawa, well, he was never late. Good morning, Toshi greeted brightly. Aizawa grunted his acknowledgement. He watched as Aizawa went to his desk, seemingly intent on going back to sleep. Aizawa could feel Toshi's eyes on him though since he sighed and turned to look at him. What? Aizawa asked irritatedly. Could I ask you a question? Toshi asked. Aizawa gave him a blank look. Toshi hesitated before he determined his silence was probably a yes. Young Midoriya, he doesn't want to use his quirk anymore. Toshi began, then amended. Well, doesn't want to use most of his quirk. Midoriya was fine with using One for All, just not the Jackal. The problem of course was that he couldn't control One for All without the Jackal. Not yet anyway. If he refuses to use his quirk at all then he'll probably end up failing out. Or expelled. Aizawa replied flatly. Expelled. Toshi gasped and fell into a coughing fit. When he was finally able to breathe again he saw Aizawa had moved closer and was offering him a napkin. Thanks, Toshi murmured and wiped the blood away. I don't know how to help him, he admitted quietly, looking up at Aizawa from where he sat at his desk. Talk to him, Aizawa suggested with a shrug. Better yet, have him confront the Jackal. While that idea had merit, Toshi wasn't exactly sure how to go about doing that. He wasn't sure they really communicated too well. Maybe that was part of the problem. What I want to know is why my quirk didn't work on Midoriya at the USJ but did at the sports festival. Aizawa fixed Toshi with a look like he knew Toshi was aware of a whole lot more than he let on. That's a good question. Toshi commented, not sure what Aizawa wanted him to say. Aizawa rolled his eyes and snorted. You seem to know a lot about his quirk. A lot more than I do, and a lot more than the registry. Aizawa pointed out, tone just a little clipped. Toshi began, but realized it was better to just go with as much of the truth as possible. Hopefully what he told Aizawa could even help Midoriya in some way. Prior to him coming to UA I was helping him learn to control his quirk. Aizawa nodded, obviously remembering what Toshi had told him before. Toshi coughed into his fist, continued. His quirk, Jackal, is sentient. Midoriya describes it as being in the dark when the Jackal takes over. Toshi hesitated. At the USJ. Toshi let out a breath as he remembered the USJ. The phantom sight and smell made his stomach roll. He swallowed. Aizawa waited. At the USJ Midoriya let the Jackal out. He went into the dark voluntarily. The Jackal said he was asleep, he wasn't fighting for control. Toshi continued. During his match with Shinso, well, he was fighting for control. He said he wasn't in the dark, he was still there, just trapped. Trapped in fighting. I didn't erase Midoriya's quirk at all. Aizawa murmured thoughtfully. I erased Shinso's quirk, allowing Midoriya to throw the jackal into the dark. Probably, Toshi offered. He wasn't completely sure, but it made sense. He wondered if that's why it was such a fast and violent transformation back too, because part of Midoriya wanted it that way. The jackal had never left behind its flesh and blood before, always fully retreating into Midoriya when it left. But Midoriya had ripped the jackal off of himself and shoved its consciousness deep inside. It suggested to Toshi that Midoriya still had a deep-seated fear and maybe even hatred for the jackal. Toshi frowned and glanced at Aizawa, who still looked thoughtful. Toshi wasn't sure he could get Midoriya to use the jackal again, at least not anytime soon. Maybe not even by the time of final exams. Failed out or expelled. Toshi didn't like to even think those were options. But Aizawa was ruthless as a teacher. Toshi needed to do something to help Midoriya. He wouldn't use the jackal, but he was willing to use one for all. That was the only solution Toshi could think of. He had to work with Midoriya on regulating one for all without the jackal. Izuku wasn't surprised he had no offers from any agencies for interning. After what he'd done on national television, attacking Shinso and almost ripping his throat out, Izuku couldn't blame them. He was stupid to ever think that he could control his quirk. He'd ended up being disqualified because he'd run away. And because he'd caused the faculty to get involved in the fight. Shinso was out too, but that was Izuku's fault, not Shinso's. Izuku hoped Shinso got some offers from some good agencies, but he probably wouldn't since he hadn't been able to show off his quirk. Not really, anyway. Todoroki had won the sports festival. It wasn't unexpected. But Todoroki had won using only his ice. Izuku knew he was supposed to be able to control fire as well, but he hadn't used it. He'd won with only half his quirk. It gave Izuku hope that he could still be a good hero even if he didn't use the jackal. Kaken got second place and was pissed off more than normal. Except his anger wasn't as violent and volatile as Izuku was used to. He wondered if it had anything to do with Kaken having to see Hound Dog every day after school. The only reason Izuku even knew about that was because he'd seen Kaken go into Hound Dog's office several times when Izuku was on his way to the faculty room to see Toshinori. Izuku's phone buzzed. It was Toshinori. Young Midoriya, please meet me after class if you are able. Izuku couldn't help smiling. His message was almost formal, at complete odds with how Toshinori treated him. Of course Izuku messaged back that he would meet him. Izuku would never pass up a chance to be with Toshinori. With their meeting set, Izuku started wishing the day would go by faster. Finally, classes ended for the day. Izuku said goodbye to his friends and rushed off to the break room Toshinori had indicated. Toshinori was making tea when Izuku lightly knocked on the door and slid it open. "Ah, young Midoriya, how are you?" Toshinori asked. Just seeing him brought a smile to Izuku's face. Life always just seemed better whenever Toshinori was around. "Fine, good, how are you?" Izuku stammered, tripping over his words in his haste to answer Toshinori's question. "I'm fine, have a seat." Toshinori gestured in the direction of the couch and chair that sat across from it, a short coffee table in between. Izuku considered the seating arrangement. He could take the chair, giving Toshinori the whole couch. But then they'd have a table between them and that seemed wrong somehow. If Izuku sat on the couch, Toshinori might take the chair though, thinking he was giving Izuku the whole couch to be comfortable on. Izuku didn't like that either. Instead of taking a seat like Toshinori had suggested, Izuku went up alongside Toshinori where he was pouring tea into 2 cups. Toshinori startled a little, surprised. Izuku gave him an easy smile as he dropped 2 sugar cubes into one of the cups and some mint in the other. "You remembered," Toshinori said, sounding a little nervous for some reason. Izuku's brow creased. "Of course I did," Izuku replied, taking his cup. He remembered everything about Toshinori. Then he stood there and waited for Toshinori, who seemed a little bit at a loss, which was funny since he was the one who had invited Izuku here. Izuku moved towards the chair. Toshinori seemed to relax a little and went over to take a seat on the couch. Izuku altered his trajectory and took a seat beside Toshinori on the couch. Blue Eyes blinked at him, then he coughed and looked away. So, what are your plans for the week-long internship? Toshinori asked. Izuku felt his stomach drop. I didn't have any offers, Izuku admitted reluctantly, his gaze falling to his lap as he set his untouched cup of tea on the table. It wasn't something he really wanted to admit to Toshinori, but he wasn't going to lie. It really shouldn't have been that depressing, after all not everyone received offers. The vast majority of his classmates hadn't received even one. But Izuku had won the race without even using his quirk, and he'd made it to the third round. Everyone who made it to the third round got offers. Everyone but Izuku. I know, Toshinori answered softly. That's alright though, Izuku looked up at Toshinori, he wore an expression of determination. During the time everyone else is at their internships you and I can work on your control of One for All. Oh, okay. Izuku replied enthusiastically. It was better than okay. Izuku would get to spend a whole week with Toshinori. It wouldn't be an official internship, but Izuku didn't care. It would be like the training they'd done together before, only better this time because Izuku probably would end up bone-tired at the end of every day. Toshinori smiled at his enthusiasm, but it looked like he had more to say. The way he was hesitating and chewing over whatever he wanted to say gave Izuku a pretty good idea of where Toshinori was trying to steer the conversation. I'm done with the Jackal. Izuku said quietly, his excitement curbed by the change in topic. He couldn't help tensing. He could feel the Jackal inside. Coward. Toshinori let out a sigh. Midoriya, Toshinori sounded tired. Izuku immediately felt bad, he didn't want to be the cause of Toshinori feeling like that. Toshinori seemed to think better of whatever he'd planned on saying next though. Instead he asked, can you communicate with the Jackal? Izuku blinked. What? I should have asked you that a long time ago, but I assumed you couldn't communicate from the way you knew nothing about it. Toshinori continued, he offered an apologetic smile, like he'd made a mistake or something. But he hadn't. Izuku wasn't entirely sure. Sometimes I can hear it. I think it can hear me, he shrugged a little helplessly. I've never really tried. There was a thought then, no, a memory of sorts, of the black expanse of his heart, or maybe it was the place behind the door. He'd come face to face with the Jackal, hadn't he? It was like trying to grasp onto the vestiges of a dream. The memory slipped through his fingers and he shook his head, unsure whether it was real or not. Would you? Toshinori asked, try? Izuku bit his lip. He didn't want to. The Jackal, on the few occasions Izuku had heard it, hadn't had very many good things to say anyway. Izuku knew it called him a coward. He was though, wasn't he? Coward. Isn't that what Toshinori suggested too? That he was trying to run away from his quirk? That's all he ever did, huh? Run. Izuku was tired of running. Izuku let out a long breath. Okay. Toshinori smiled, really smiled, like Izuku had given him the world or something. Just that smile was worth it, Izuku decided, even as a ball of dread and anxiety coiled inside his chest. Do you have an idea of how to go about it? Toshinori asked. Izuku gave that some thought. It would involve having to draw on the Jackal in some way or another, which would risk letting it out, something Izuku didn't like and knew was dangerous. He'd have to do it somewhere safe or with someone who could stop the Jackal if it did manage to get out. He couldn't help feeling depressed about the whole thing though. As much as he realized he shouldn't run away from his quirk, shouldn't be a coward, he also hated that he promised himself not to use the Jackal again, and yet here he was breaking it all over again. Right. So if he was going to do this, how and where's what he needed to figure out. Somewhere safe, somewhere. UA is safe, isn't it? Toshinori asked. Izuku's mouth snapped shut and a blush rose on his cheeks. He'd been muttering out loud again. Izuku started, but realized Toshinori was right. Yeah, actually, UA would work. Great. Toshinori grinned. I'll speak with the principal about getting permission to use the campus grounds. working on one for all and attempting to contact the Jackal. Well, this would certainly make for an interesting week.